This is a second interview with David Driskell for the Getty Research Institute's African-American Art History Initiative in association with the Oral History Center at UC Berkeley. The interview has been conducted by Bridget Cooks and Amanda Tweez at Mr. Driskell's home in Hyattsville, Maryland on April 12, 2019. So we all had a nice break and we're back in the saddle. Bridget, why don't you take us?
Okay. So we were talking about life at Howard and your job at the Arts and Crafts Supply Company and learning how to drive and then doing deliveries. And one of the other important things that you did while you were at Howard was you met Thelma, your wife. So how did you meet? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was still working at Arts and Crafts in 1951. And I was, by that time, a pretty good student at Howard. I had taken my first art courses, had made good grades, and had transitioned to become a scholarship student. So thereafter, I paid no tuition. I had full scholarship the rest of the way. I had kind of settled down in my work ethic. I was driving the station wagon for Arts and Crafts. And I had moved out of the family circuit, that is, living with relatives. It was my first roommate, not on campus, but I moved out northeast. And one of the students whom I had met was a young man named Jasper Woody, who was in my ROTC class. And all male students were required to take ROTC, either Air Force or Army. I chose Army Infantry. He did choose Air Force, but there were certain classes we took together, got to know him. And we started talking, and it turns out we had family connections. We weren't family, but some of his family was from the next county. He was living with his aunt from Gaston County, North Carolina. I was from Cleveland County, the next county over. So we kind of set up this relationship. So then he got nosy and wanted to know about my social life. And I told him I was dating a young lady from home, not steady, but, you know, I had known, who was a member of one of my father's churches. He said, well, I'm dating so-and-so, and she has several sisters, and I'd like to introduce you to one of them. And I said, you know, tell me about them and so forth. And he told me about this family. He was dating the second sister. Thelma was the oldest. There were 7 sisters.
Wow.
Not all of dating age, but Thelma and Effie, where he was dating Effie. He said, I'd like to introduce you to her, because she lived like 2 blocks from where we lived, way out northeast, out Benning Road. And so he said, I'd like to take you over and introduce you to something. I said, okay, all right. So this was, say, around September maybe, because I'd gone home, visited with my parents, gone to the revival meeting, had actually stayed overnight with my friend's family when I was at the revival meeting, and then came back with my father and came back to Washington. And so Woody, Jasper, introduces me, takes me over and introduces me to Thelma.
And this is 1951?
1951.
Okay.
The fall of 1951. So we gradually started dating, and she was enrolled at a clerical school, Cortez Peters, on U Street, which was the biggest secretarial school, one of the biggest in the country at that time. He had the title of being the fastest typist in the United States. Typing was big back then, you know, and especially for black women who would go into government.
Okay.
So she was not enrolled in college. As a matter of fact, she had only gone through the 11th grade. So she had to do that 12th grade before she could consider college. And she did it here at Roosevelt High School in Washington after we got married.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, after the children were born and everything.
Good for her.
Yeah, and then she didn't go to college until we went to Tennessee, and then she enrolled at Tennessee State University while I was teaching at Fisk. Anyway, backtrack. So I met, Woody introduced me to Thelma. We kind of hit it off. And then this is like September, October. Then about December, we started talking about marriage.
Wow.
Now, I'm a sophomore. Ain't got nothing. She ain't got nothing. But here we are, talking about marriage and so forth. And Thelma had an aunt, Fanny Johnson, who was like the entrepreneur in the family. And I think one of her great desires in life was to make sure that all 7 of those girls were married off before she left this world. And she accomplished that,
really?
You know. Anyway, she had these ideals about marriage of you marry, somebody's on the way up, and you do this and do that. They were from North Carolina. They were all, I call them gentry landowners in the Lake Gaston area. They all had big parcels of land down there, very valuable land now. But we all looked up to Aunt Fanny because she was the kind of mastermind for the family and into this kind of business and into that. And she was very religious and so forth and so on. And she took us on our very first official date to Richmond, Virginia. We had been dating, I'd go by the house and so forth, but the real kind of official date was when the family would know you're serious and so forth. In December, she took us to Richmond, Virginia, to what they used to call the mosque. And it was, she said, we're going to a concert. I thought she meant jazz and all that. It was a gospel concert. But it was the only time I had ever seen Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Oh, you did? Wow.
Madame Marie Knight and Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Wow.
So I've always had great fondness for gospel music because of my tradition out of fundamentalist church and so forth, my father being a Baptist minister by then. And this has nothing to do with my upbringing, and I shouldn't be claiming it in any way, but my father's third church was over in Polk, P-O-L-K, Polk County, North Carolina, which was a fairly different atmosphere from the farming community where I grew up. It was more like a resort community. A lot of northerners came down there for the winter. There were vineyards and that kind of. So a lot of the African Americans over there worked for these wealthy people, had their own homes, and my father would always point to me, he said, this is the way you should be living. They were teachers and so forth and so on. That one of those 4th grade teachers who had a master's from Michigan, she lived in that county.
Okay.
And over in the town of Tryon, they were just a little more progressive than we were. They had a Rosenwald school. And I was always so jealous because I wanted to go to a Rosenwald school. They were better schools. Julius Rosenwald had put money into these black schools. And at my father's church, they would have what we call the singing conventions every fifth Sunday. And we would all compete. I was director of the junior choir, the gospel choir. I didn't know one word of music. But I'd get up and direct them, and we'd out-sing this group, and we'd out-sing that group. And one of the groups that would come and out-sing everybody else was from Tryon. And guess who the pianist was?
I don't know.
Well, you wouldn't know about that name anyway.
No.
Her name was Eunice Wyman.
Oh, I do know this name. Oh no, this is going to be recorded that I can't come up with the name. I thought that was, I know her name. Yeah, so she's civil rights, Mississippi goddamn.
Yes, indeed.
I just can't call her name right now.
Nina Simone.
Nina Simone, thank you. Right, North Carolina, because her birthday
Tryon,
was recently.
North Carolina.
That is right.
Her family was Methodist. My family was Baptist.
Okay.
But they would exchange churches and so forth. They'd come to Green Creek, my father's church. We'd go over to their church and so forth and so on. We'd try and out-sing them. They try and out-sing us and so forth and so on.
And she's the piano player for one of these groups.
Yeah, she grew up playing the piano. There was a white lady who saw her talent early.
Yes, I
And
do
sent
know
her
this
to-
story, yes.
Gave her music lessons and then encouraged her to go north. But she used to play for the gospel group. And the last time I saw her was 1968 at Fisk. She came to perform.
Wow.
And that just happened that year. I was, at HBCUs, you got to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
I was over the Lyceum committee, booking all the people to come in and entertain, the jazz singers, the whomever.
That's exciting.
And so after her concert, she sang Mississippi Goddamn in
She
the chapel.
did?
Oh, yes, she did.
And how was that received at Fisk at
Well,
that time?
1968, well,
Okay.
because prior to that, Grace Bumbry
Okay.
had come to do classical. And, there was this air about, and I remember she did Menotti's The Telephone. And the students in the balcony, they were, black, that ain't black. They just drowned her out.
No.
It was very, very unkind of them. But that was the atmosphere
Sure.
at that time.
In 68.
If you didn't integrate some of the black experience, you were in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And Grace obviously didn't know that. And I remember she said something in, how does one say that in English? And they yelled at her and called her some names. And it was not very nice. But they weren't tolerating any. She'd been in Europe and she said she'd forgotten how to. They told her how to say it.
She grew up in the U.S.
Oh, of course.
All right, now David, let me look at the script and see where I want us to go. Now, you went on this first date.
Yeah.
Official date.
Yeah. And we liked each other. We kind of hit it off and we started dating and became rather serious. And eventually, I guess with the help of Aunt Fanny and a few others, they started talking about, what are your intentions? And because she had gotten one of them married off to a dentist. Not in this family, but the other family.
And you were 21?
I was 20. And I had to go home to get my parents' approval because we were going to get married in January. But in D.C., you had to be 21 to marry on your own.
Okay.
So I went home Christmas, wanted to go home anyway, got their approval. And I had to go through the thing of who is she and what kind of family does she come from and blah, blah, blah. And at that time, Thelma was very fair-skinned and long hair and everything. And my mother, I remember her, she said, "You sure that girl not white?" And
really?
Yes. There was this thing about, you don't leave the race,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And because her brother, Uncle Sat, after World War I, he went north to Long Island and eventually to Far Rockaway Beach, and he married a Caucasian woman. And he never came home again. And when Grandma Hahn died in December of 1938, I was 7 years old, and I remember they sent him a telegram, and he responded, and Grandma Hahn was still living with Aunt May. He, in that same house where I had the party to go off to school and everything, and Uncle Sat responded by saying, you know I can never come home, so I can't come to Hahn's funeral.
Was he passing his wife?
I don't see how Uncle Sat could have passed. On the other hand, he may have said Indian or something like that. Because of course, he was much fairer than I. He didn't have what you call straight hair, but it wasn't like mine.
So.
And he had keener features, and he was very fair. He was like Thelma's color, you know. But we never knew whether he was passing or whether it was pure love or what. And the last I heard, Aunt May was going with me to Maine in 1968, traveling. We went out the long way, out Long Island. She went out to visit her stepdaughter who was living in Montauk Island, Montauk or something, anyway. She was a farmer out there, and Aunt May said, I'm going to look in the telephone book and see if I can find Sat. This is 1968, and I suspect he was still alive. And she found a William Cloud. A William Clyde, C-L-Y-D-E. Because the boys, after all this rigmarole and they're taking the land and all that, they changed their name to Clyde.
Wow.
That's why I wanted to be like them. I changed my name from my mother's C-L-O-U-D to C-L-Y-D-E. Because I wanted to be like Uncle Sat. I get to come trying to straighten my hair and make it look like Uncle Sat and all that. And so I literally changed mine to C-L-Y-D-E. And that's the way it is now.
I didn't know that.
And I regretted it later.
Yeah.
Because Cloud was the real name. But the boys all changed their name to C-L-Y-D-E. No more Cloud. No more Cloud. And so she found William Cloud, Far Rockaway Beach, New York. You know, we didn't have all these tracing elements and things.
Sure.
It had to be the same person.
Did she call?
She called, and evidently one of the children answered the phone. And Aunt May said afterwards, she just said, is William Cloud, who was in one time in the Army, she didn't tell him who he was, she was in the Army. Is this the William Cloud who came from Georgia and settled on Far Rockaway Beach, New York, or so on? And he was in the Army, and she gave him a little history. And the man who answered the phone said yes, but she didn't go into any other detail and said he wasn't there. And when she got off the phone, she said, David, I talked to one of Sat's sons and she said, that man is white. She said, he didn't sound like us. So she was like, I wasn't going to tell him who I was.
Right. And break the secret.
Yeah. So that was the last connection, other than my sister Georgia, the younger sister, who died 9 years ago, used to write to him back and forth. And he'd write, and they had this correspondence going while she was in grade school, until she was like in the 6th grade or something. And then she wrote and told him that she was going to come up there to see him. And then she never heard from him again.
Oh, no. That's too bad.
So we know that there was the race thing. He may have been passing for white, but to me, when I never saw him, but to look at his picture, I just couldn't see him as white. But maybe some did. But anyway, that's a long story.
All right,
So that's how I get Clyde in my name instead of Cloud.
I didn't know that at all.
That is interesting.
So, okay, I'm going to bring us back. So you were given permission to marry Thelma.
Yes.
And where did you get married?
In Washington.
In Washington.
At 554 24th Street, Northeast Washington, D.C.
Was that a house?
At a house. Aunt Fanny's house.
Oh, okay.
Aunt Fanny's house on January 9th, 1952.
Okay. Okay. And I wanted to also talk about other things you were doing around that time. So you started working in art galleries.
Yes, well, I was still driving the taxi.
Whose taxi was this? Did you have to rent the taxi?
I had to
or-
rent the taxi
Okay.
from my brother-in-law, Imperial Taxi.
Okay.
I rented the taxi weekly from my brother-in-law
Okay.
and made just enough to pay the taxi rental and enough for food.
Is this why you remember addresses so well? Because you were a taxi driver?
I don't think so.
No?
I just,
Okay.
it was only so many places that I lived.
Yeah.
And but I remember streets and things like I talked back to the
GPS.
GPS and I said, no, that's not the easiest way to get there and all that. Shut up and all that.
Okay, so you were working as a taxi driver, but you had a scholarship
I had
at
a
that point.
scholarship.
But you were working as a taxi driver. I have noted that you worked at the Howard University Gallery of
Gallery of
Art.
Art. And part-time I'd go down to Barnard Aiden Gallery and work in between, mainly for food, because Mr. Herring and Mr. Aiden were very good cooks.
Oh, really?
And they would cook things like, Mr. Aiden was excellent at making crab salad and things like that. Did you just, I didn't grow up eating any crab salad.
Where was he from?
He was from Charleston, South Carolina.
Really?
And Mr. Aiden was a very strange character in the sense that he always felt he was superior to everybody else. He came from, he'd tell you in a minute, we were never slaves. And he'd go into all of that. And his mother came to live with him in the 50s, and I would come in to work downstairs in the gallery. And she would be sitting there in the living room with her black dress on and white collar, very much like George O'Keeffe, in those photos. And she would say to me when I came in, David, fetch me the paper. I'd have to go on the porch and get the paper for her. The paper's been there all day. And my attitude was she just had to have somebody black waiting on her. But they tell you in a hurry, no, we were never slaves. And, and we were upper class.
So, but what was the focus of the gallery? Because I associate that gallery with one of the first, or maybe the only integrated.
It was the first black and then integrated gallery of that type in the nation's capital.
Amazing.
1943, when it was founded.
Right.
But Mr. Herring was helping to establish that relationship through the Howard University Gallery since 1928.
Now, why do you think, given the high attitude of Mr. Aiden, he was interested in black artists?
Well, he never denied his heritage or anything like that. He just felt that there were certain classes of people that he was... When I was at Catholic University doing my MFA, I stayed there one summer, and I was taking a course in the sociology of class and all of that kind of stuff, because my graduate minor, because you had to do a graduate minor outside of your field.
Okay.
My graduate minor was psychological counseling. And
Trying to see where this is going. Going back to Mr. Aiden.
yes, so he would ask me questions. Are we upper class, middle class? What are we? I said, well, let me tell you what the prerequisites are for being upper class. I said, you have to have money. I said 9 times out of 10, you have to have been born into money.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I went on to articulate the whole thing. And he was like, almost sweating, like, well, we aren't upper class? And I was like, no, you're not. I don't think he ever forgave me for breaking down that. But he was an interesting man, very interesting. But Mr. Herring was just down to earth. He was born in Clio, South Carolina, of a black servant woman and a Jewish father. But you'd see Mr. Herring on the street, you just assumed he was white.
Mm-hmm.
And the same with Mr. Aiden,
Okay.
Except Mr. Herring would tell the tale about Mr. Herring never learned to drive. And Mr. Aiden, they would go south driving. And Mr. Herring never trusted the notion that people would think he was white. He would never pass.
Okay.
But Mr. Aiden would pass in a minute. And Mr. Aiden would drive up to the restaurant, get out, go in, and go and sit in a window where he can sit there and wave at Mr. Herring. Mr. Herring said, bring me some food. I'm not going in there and get lynched. That kind of attitude. It all ties in with the Green Book and all that
Yeah.
stuff. None of this has anything to do with art, but these were very interesting people.
It's interesting because they are part of the art world, but they're navigating all kinds of social
They have
restrictions.
to go through all of these gaps and things to get, and at the same time, they have this great respect in the arts community.
Okay.
Duncan Phillips, that I met Duncan Phillips at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery.
Wow.
I'm on the board of trustees of the Phillips collection now. And at one of my first meetings, the director said, there's someone here who met Duncan Phillips. Nobody else did. And it was I.
Wow.
None of the other trustees had ever met him. I met Langston Hughes at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery. I met Jacob Lawrence and Roland
And
Beard.
they became friends of the family.
Oh yeah, it was major. But he also exhibited European American artists,
Mm-hmm.
Rice Ferreira, Theodore Stamos, folk like that.
What kind of things did you learn working at the gallery? What kind of things did you do? What were your responsibilities? Because you weren't a porter again, were you?
Well, I was to help with the hanging of the show.
Okay.
I was to put things away in the stacks and so forth. And I'll tell you a story about that time, 1953. I had gone to Skowhegan and come back. And
Well, we want to talk about that. Do you want to talk about Skowhegan now, or you want to tell the story and we'll come back to it?
well, I'll tell the story because it's Skowhegan a little later down the road. But I'm working at the Bonnet Aiden Gallery. And Morris Lewis has his first job teaching at Howard. That's the only place he ever taught. You'd never see that
Wow.
in his biography. Did you know he taught at Howard?
I did from your biography,
Oh, right. Okay.
but not his.
Well,
yeah.
nobody else believes he taught at Howard because it's not in print. They wouldn't put it in print. But Morris couldn't get a job teaching any other place because nobody believed in abstraction in Washington at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Had Harold Rosenberg and Clement
Greenberg.
Greenberg,
Mm-hmm.
had they not put that out, that this is what's happening, it ain't New York by itself, it's Washington, nobody would have believed it.
Mm-hmm.
So Ken Nolan, Morris Lewis, Gene Davis, and all of them, they were beginning to experiment. I had been delivering these art supplies to a man in Georgetown named Leon. Oh my God, it'll come to me.
Okay.
All right. Anyway, he was never considered a part of the color school, but he was one of the first abstractionists to do that kind of painting. And I would go there, deliver, and he'd sit down and talk with me about, what he was doing. He was one of the first to use synthetic paints.
Really?
And there were very few synthetic paints at that time. Leonard Beaucourt had brought out a paint he called Magna, M-A-G-N-A. But you used turpentine with it, not water. And later they all got involved in the synthetics in which you used water. But they said the Magna was not good for you, and they said may have had something to do with the lungs and all of that.
Toxic in some ways.
Yeah, so anyway, Morris came to the gallery one day. I'm there at Barnett Hayden, and he had this painting about this tall, long, on his head, and Mr. Aiden stopped him at the door. And he said, "Where are you going with that painting?" And Morris said, "I'm bringing it to you because I want to be in your collection." I mean, that's how important it was to be in the Barnett Aiden gallery. And Mr. Aiden said, "But I don't like your work. I don't want you in my collection."
Oh.
And so Mr. Herring said to me, "Driskell, come and get the painting and take it downstairs." And I came, and I was probably in the kitchen eating or doing something, I came and brought the painting down through the basement door, and there was a hot water pipe here and a cold water pipe there. And I placed that painting on those two pipes, and it stayed there until after Mr. Aiden died. It was never shown.
Wow.
I wish I had it now, but
Yeah.
it stayed there until after Mr. Aiden's death, and Mr. Herring, then Mr. Aiden died in 1961. Mr. Herring died in 69. So it stayed there for another 5 or 6 years, and Mr. Herring sold it to an art dealer and framer down on 7th Street, by the name of Harry Cohen. So Skowhegan, but anyway, that was pre-Skowhegan.
Okay. So, were there things at these galleries that I was going to ask, were there things at these galleries that you weren't learning when you were at Howard? But it also seems that it's connected to Howard because Herring was...
Oh yeah, Herring had just retired. Herring retired from teaching at Howard in 54.
Okay.
So I'm overlapping about 2 years. And Mr. Herring was, he would stand outside of the Founders Library where his office was and the gallery and wait for me to come and drive him home. And when I got out of class, he'd be standing there with his cape on and his hat pulled over his eye. You know how Langston used to wear his hat kind of pulled? He'd wear his hat, Stetson pulled him. And
was he paying you, or this was just part of your responsibility?
no, he paid me.
He did pay you, okay.
Yeah, he paid me 50 cents an hour or something like that. He didn't pay me much. But it all helped.
Mm-hmm.
It was hard to get a job in between classes.
Sure.
So I drove the taxi, and then I'd go there and work with them. And he would sometimes, I know he always had his cufflinks and his tie, I have all these stick pins that I wear now, I guess I'm kind of imitating that era. They were gentlemen, they were people of culture, and you don't see much of that anymore. And that's why I was so impressed when I saw Professor Porter standing there. He's teaching a painting course with a necktie and an English suit and that kind of thing. Yeah, I want to be like that.
So you do well in school. You go from being a C student in history to A student in art. You're winning prizes.
Mhm.
Well, and so let's talk about Skowhegan then. So 1953,
Mhm.
you're still a student at Howard, but you receive a fellowship to attend the art program at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine.
Right.
So how did that come about? And I have a whole series of questions about that. What did you expect from your experience there? Did Thelma go with you? And wanted to hear you talk about the kind of work that you were making. I think you were making both social realist works and also natural landscapes.
Yes, I was told later that normally they sent graduate students to Skowhegan, but they wanted to make sure Howard was the only black school represented at Skowhegan. There'd be black students,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't come from Howard. For example, in the very first class at Skowhegan, there was a black student. He's what, 94, 95 now. He lives in Maine, the painter, Ashley Bryan.
Okay.
And there's a film out on him. So anyway, but they wanted to make sure that Skowhegan did that. Any student they sent there was ready and well prepared to compete. Because you know, the Art Institute of Chicago, Art Students League, the Brooklyn Museum School, Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I mean, it was high cotton. So Howard, the only black school, represented.
But you weren't a graduate student, right? You were.
No, I was a junior, and it wasn't supposed to be happening. So Professor Porter spoke to me and said, I'd like you to consider going to Skowhegan this summer. And I said, no, I can't go because I have to work. I have a family.
Right. So you had one daughter or two? You had
I had one daughter and one on the way.
Okay, and he's saying, I'm
He's
sending
saying,
you
to Skowhegan. And I'm like, no, you're not, because I gotta work. And so the subject comes up in the faculty meeting. The faculty would vote on who goes. And the subject comes up, and I learned this 20 years later from Lois. And they say, we're going to send so-and-so, whoever's in graduate. And Lois speaks up and says, I would like for David Driskell to go.
Really?
Because I'm Lois's pet, remember? I had taken Lois's watercolor class, and she was very impressed with what I did with watercolor and so forth. And they wouldn't let Lois teach oil painting. She only teach design and watercolor. That's ladies. You know. The men taught the oil and so forth. But Lois was a better painter than anybody else.
Well.
So Lois said, no, I want David. And Porter speaks up and says, he can't go. He has to work. And Lois said, oh, we'll work that out. We'll take care of it. So she does persuade them. And I think I may have been the first undergraduate from Howard to go to Skowhegan. Skowhegan, I hadn't heard anything about it. Skowhegan, didn't know anything about it. I'd never been north of Baltimore.
Okay.
So they said, you got to get on the train, go all the way to Maine. I said, where is that? And so I did. I had to change trains in Boston. So Lois was going to arrange for me to stay overnight with her brother who lived in Boston at the time. And he had a daughter about my age, and I think he decided, oh, I don't want him coming here, you know. And so I had to rearrange to get a hotel in Boston. I had never stayed in a hotel in my life.
And so what was that like?
1953. I'm 22 years old. And so I had my first hotel experience living in a hotel in Boston overnight, getting up the next morning, eating baked beans and so forth and so on. And then continuing on to Boston. I mean to Maine.
Maine, right.
So I get to Maine and they meet me in Waterville, the train to Waterville, and take me the next 12 miles to Skowhegan. And I get there and everybody has an assignment. So I become the studio, like in charge of the painting studio where Leonard Beaucourt made and ground the paints. He taught a course called Methods and Materials of Painting, and I was his assistant.
Okay.
So I learned to hand grind the paints like, ground the paints like the masters and all of that through Leonard. We'd established a relationship that lasted for the rest of his life.
Mm-hmm.
I was, as I said, I was working at Arts and Crafts, and they were selling a brand of paints that really inferior at that time, Sargents. And Mr. Beaucourt said to me, if you can go back and convince your boss, Mr. Ellery, to throw those Sargents out and take on Beaucourt and Bellini, he said, you'll never have to worry about paints as long as I'm around.
Oh, that's a good deal.
And he kept his promise.
Really?
I never bought any, and I did. I went back and sold that notion to Mr. Ellery. He got rid of Sargent. He took in Beaucourt and Bellini, because there were only two art stores in Washington at that time. Muths, M-U-T-H-S, and Arts and Crafts. And Muths sold Winsor Newton and high class Rembrandt. Well, Beaucourt was just as good because it was handmade, and then he sold the Bellini product. And so then when I graduate, Lenny sends me all these paints to Talladega. When I come to Howard, he brings me paints. He comes to Howard and gives a demonstration.
Oh.
When I go to Fisk, he sends me paints. When I come to Maryland, he sends me paints. And I think he may have died in the mid-'80s or something. But I still have paints in my studio.
That's incredible.
And he sold his business to Golden Paints, who were his brother-in-law.
Oh, you're
I didn't know that connection. And I went to Sam Gilliam's studio maybe 10 years ago. And I was like, wow, all these paints in big jars. Where do you get them? He said, write to Sam Golden. Tell him I told you to write him. And I wrote to Sam Golden because Sam was dead by then. So his son Mark answered.
Okay.
And he said, Dad, this is no longer here. Yes, we bought Beaucourt and my uncle out. And so then I told him the story of my relationship to Beaucourt. And I had ordered maybe $3,000 worth of paint. And he said, you're like third generation in this lineage of ours. He said, everything is free for you. So.
Because Sam's studio is just packed with Golden. I remember going there and
It still is.
he has all the different textures,
Yeah,
and it's like he's working for them with all the stuff he has. So.
And I didn't know the relationship until he told me. He said, you're like third generation Beaucourt, Golden. He said, so these are free. So I haven't had to order any more paints lately. You know, I should be painting more, but. So that's the Skowhegan working with Lenny.
Okay. Well, so I want to ask about the kind of art that you were making at Skowhegan. So I'm thinking about works like City Quartet, social realist works, and the natural landscapes that you were making at the time. And I know that you were starting to make work around this time, maybe a little bit later, like pine trees and young pines growing. That's later, but thinking about the natural landscape and figurative work.
Well, first there was this insatiable desire to be a social commentary on, because I was studying with Jack Levine. So I wanted to learn the old master method of glazing, counter skirt painting and all that, which I did. Out of that comes Behold Thy Son.
Okay, 1956.
1956, they was commenting on the Emmett till death. But at the same time, I'm doing these little paintings like City Quartet, Boy with Bird, and so forth, which I'm using some of Levine's style, but I am not being that serious about the social aspect of it.
Okay.
I mean, four boys in the streets smoking a cigarette. That's not a. But to me back then, that was, that was kids. You didn't smoke, and I did see kids smoking. So I'm going to comment on that, But I also was creating abstractions at the same time. And
did you feel like you were exploring all kinds of different styles or subject matters, or did you feel pressured to do one kind of thing over another?
I never felt pressured. I felt like I should be doing all kinds of things, and I was.
And you were working in oil.
Oil.
You were doing printmaking. Were you doing sketching?
I was sketching. They had a little sketch in the show in New York that I had forgotten all about.
The residency show that's up now.
Yeah, a little self-portrait of my standing there, and
from this time period.
Yeah, well, 56.
Wow.
I don't remember. Well, they found it in the midst of all these things, and then they had two other self-portraits, more recent one. But that little one, everybody, the women from the Met just kept saying, "Oh my God, this is so sensitive. This is so this." I hadn't seen it for like 50 years.
But where did it come from? You think they had it all this time?
They went through the drawers out there, and there are layers and layers of stuff that I haven't seen for years.
The drawings out where? In Maine?
No, in the studio.
Oh, right here.
Mm-hmm.
So you have layers of stuff you haven't even looked at in a while.
Yeah. Rodney and Daphne are supposed to be cataloging all this
Oh,
stuff.
okay, that's great.
But, there was that kind of stuff. And then the landscapes. I was so impressed with the landscape in Maine. The beauty of the trees and all that. And that's when I come back and tell Thelma, famous artists go to Maine in the summer. And they have a studio, and someday we have to have a home in Maine studio.
Yeah.
We, of course, were living with her mother,
But it came. It did
came,
happen.
and as they say in the Bible, and it came to pass.
And so, thinking about Skowhegan, the influence of it on your work. So you're saying certainly that the environment had a big influence.
Oh, definitely.
You're working with Jack Levine there. You're working with Beaucourt there. Did you start to focus in terms of thinking about a particular style of artist? Did you start to think of yourself as a particular kind of artist, or you were still?
I was still exploring.
Okay.
And I was interested in abstraction. And I think I was a pretty good abstractionist, but I still wanted to make a statement. And I guess the Behold Thy Son cured me of that.
Well, let's talk about that, because this is still one of the paintings that has one of them that has a great deal of resonance over the decades. I mean, it's over 60 years old now? Is that right? It's from 1956?
56, yes.
So you were inspired by the Emmett Till
murder. I was teaching at Talladega.
Okay.
And I was just eaten up with the morass of that situation, the hate of all of that. And the incidents on campus that people would occasionally come through, Klan come through shooting in on the campus, and just
in Alabama and Talladega.
In Alabama, George Wallace was governor, and all the crazy things that were happening, the marching downtown, trying to integrate the little town of Talladega. And I was just so just tired of people and how unkind and how nasty they were. And I just said, well, I'm going to just paint trees, pine trees, because they are so loving and giving, and they don't hate you. So I started doing these pines, and they kind of embraced me to a certain extent. So I started thinking about the pines at night, the pines at this time of day, pines in the moonlight, and so on. Every way you could think of the pines, I think I thought of it, you know. What happens when the tree is swaying and flowing, and what is the tree thinking about? What am I thinking about? And there's a symbiotic relationship. I'm giving and that tree is giving and so on. And so these trees just kind of engrossed me. And then by the time I got ready to do my thesis at Catholic U, I said to my advisor, I want to just take the pine tree and say a little about it from the point. We had to write a little about it, but mainly the images, about the history of the evergreen.
Okay.
The tracing the use of the evergreen on the sarcophagus, because it's everlasting and so forth and so on. And then because the tree, even in winter, the pine, the spruce, the cedar, and all those, they don't give up everything. They hold on throughout. So the concept of eternity and so forth. So I did my thesis with that theme in mind, but I did it seasonally. What does the pine tree look like in the fall with all the red colors and things around? What does it look like in the spring when there's the pastel, the this and that? And there's somebody in California, I think in San Francisco, who has one of those. I don't know where the others are, but who has.
One of your paintings?
Yeah, one of the thesis paintings.
Oh.
Elleren's son,
Okay.
Michael Elleren.
Oh, wow.
But he lives in San Francisco.
Okay.
Anyway, I mean, he has that painting of, and then there was summer and winter. I don't know where the university kept one.
Talladega.
And then other three.
Okay.
Yes, but when I inquired about it, nobody seemed to know anything about it at Catholic University.
So you're at Talladega and you're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to talk about, Behold Thy Son, that you made that while you were teaching, and then I want us to talk about how you got that position. But you were inspired by Emmett Till's murder.
Yeah, by the murder of Till, but by comparable concern there was, of course, the social issue, how black men especially were treated, the lynching and all of that. But this becomes, for me, not necessarily a religious subject, even though it's inspired by that portion of scripture where it says, on the cross, when Jesus turns to his mother and said, "Behold, woman, behold thy son." You know, this is the last aspect of his life on earth. And his arms are outstretched and so forth. So if you look at that figure, there's that cross-like figure. And Talisa was saying to me, she called me up maybe 3 months ago, she said, I never saw the other two women in that picture. I said, yes, the two Marys are there, his mother and another Mary, you know. And then the embellishment of the sarcophagus, you know, the casket. And so for me, it was cathartic in certain ways because I cleansed myself of wanting to be a social commentary artist. I got it out of my system.
Okay.
Like, okay, this is it. Now I don't have to solve any more problems. I can just be happy with my art.
And you said what you wanted to say.
Yeah.
And so, how do you feel about that painting today? Meaning, you know, you're explaining how you felt at the time you wanted to make artwork that made a commentary. You were able to really be satisfied with that painting. How do you think, because now it's part of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, how do you think about the significance of that painting for you? I mean, certainly for thousands and thousands and thousands of other people who see this painting every day, it means something, that there's something unfortunately perpetual
Yeah.
about it that makes it relevant. But what do you even think about having your work in that building and to be part of this moment right now?
Well, first of all, I'm proud that it's there. And I think it's dated and tied to a time and period. But the fight goes on. So I don't think it's just tied to 1956. In that sense, it's pointing to it, but it's also showing you that time hasn't changed that much. I
Okay.
can't breathe.
Right. Well, and until the case keeps getting reopened.
Indeed. So it's forever there. It's like the open casket. It's forever there.
That's right. People are still painting Emmett Till.
Yeah, it's forever there. I never thought of it in that kind of classical sense, because the painting was, when I moved away from Talladega in 1962, I left it in a closet in the old art building, along with many other things there. And it stayed there for the next 40 years. And finally, one of my former students called me up and said, "Do you realize you left one of your paintings here that was in your 1957 exhibition?" And I said, "What?" He said, "It says, 'Behold thy son.'" I said, "Oh my, that's where that painting is."
David, did you leave it on purpose?
Well, I was moving and I had room for this. I didn't have room for that. And I must have left 20 other works there. Watercolors, I did a whole series of watercolors the summer of 1961 out in Colorado Springs, of the Garden of the Gods. And, and my watercolors at that time were very much influenced by John Myron. So they were the zigzag and left them all at Talladega. I think little by little, people may have just gone into the closet and taken some home. I saw one at auction 4 years ago.
Was it credited to you?
Oh no. Well, it was said David Driskell. Oh, by now, David Driskell, so at the auction, had come from supposedly somebody in Atlanta. But who?
But it was there for 40 years. This closet full of, it's like a locker you had, or full of things that you left?
Yeah, just like these things in this closet. They didn't catalog the collection. They were Hale Woodruff's. They were all kinds of things there.
But you left it to the museum there, the gallery?
To the gallery.
Okay, I got that. Okay, I wasn't sure if they were just in some closet in the art studio.
No, I left them to the gallery. But,
okay.
But then when he saw what was going on, he said, we have no deed of gift. We have no papers. You ought to take this work back because nobody is interested.
And so did you have them shipped back to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had it. The others
were gone.
Are gone, scattered, who knows? Well, we saw one at auction.
Oh, now I understand. Well, how did you get the job at Talladega? So you were at Skowhegan in 1953. From there, did you go back to Howard?
I went back to Howard and finished in 55. And you can't imagine, I was trying to recreate this picture in my mind in New York the other day, being in one of the finest galleries in New York.
At D.C. Moore this
D.C.
weekend.
Moore.
Okay.
And thinking back, the lineage of that travel, getting there. And all the way back to that first job of how happy and delighted I was. I'm going to be a college teacher. This is what I wanted all my life. And I'm going, I've never been to Alabama before, but I'm going to Alabama, and I've heard that Talladega Aunt Millie, that, you know, the other sage in the family. And when I said, I'm getting a job at Talladega, she said, oh, David, that's one of our best schools. And she said, Talladega, Fisk, Tuskegee, Howard, Hampton. She named them, you know, like that. And she said, now I want you to do so and so. And she told me I had to. And I was going to make $300 a month. Plus I had free housing.
Wow.
And she said, I want you to put aside $50 every month. Put it in the bank and act like you don't have it. Just act like it's not there. And so I get there and I wrote and told her I put my first 50. She says, all right, I want to hear from you again such and such a year from now, and I want to know how much and so forth. And I did what Aunt Millie said. And then in 1961, came back to D.C., finishing up at Catholic University, and I'm trying to pass my French exam for graduation. At that time, I don't know if it's still true at Catholic University, the master's students took a little 2-page examination in the foreign language. The MFA, because it's a terminal degree, had to take the same exam the PhD students took.
Okay.
12 pages of idiomatic expressions, modern translation, you name it.
Wow.
And like, oh, I failed French in college in my senior year.
Oh,
And
no.
so had to get a tutor and all that. Anyway, I was doing so well in grad school, and then there was this thing facing me. Got past your French. So I had one of those big old recorders, a Wallensack they call it, reel to reel, and I'd sit and listen to Je suis sunset, you know. Je suis not smart, you know. And then I got a tutor. It didn't seem to help very much. And I was subscribing to the Christian Science Monitor. Did I ever tell you that story?
No.
And I'm reading the Monitor with the notion that I'm going to have that house in Maine one day, reading the ads. But also I'm reading Mary Baker Eddy's sermons up here in English on the Home Forum page. And she had a critic by the name of Dorothy Abloh, who, to my knowledge, in the 1950s was one of the few mainstream critics who would write about black artists.
Okay.
I had read about Tanner. I knew about him, but I had read about Tanner, Jacob Lawrence, Romeo Bearden, Dorothy Abloh.
Christian Science Monitor.
Christian Science Monitor. Big format then of the newspaper, big as the New York Times. But up here on the right on the Home Forum page, it would be what did I say her name was?
Is it Ab something?
Baker
Abloh? Abloh?
The founder of Christian Science.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Eddie, Reverend Eddie, her sermon. Mary Baker Eddy, or something like that. Anyway, there'd be her sermon up here in English. Down below it'd be in French.
Okay.
The next day, English, German. So I'm waiting weekly for this French to come out. And that's how I passed my French exam, by reading. Because I knew the Bible fairly well, and I just made comparisons. But on that same page, sometimes there would be the write-up on Bearden, on Lawrence, on Tanner, and then you thumb through the paper and there were the classified ads. Homes for sale, Maine, New Hampshire, etc. And we come upon this ad that says, 2-room cottage, electricity, running water, 6 acres of land, trout brook, and pine trees. And that sold me. And I said to Thelma, oh, I think we can afford this. This is the nest egg that Aunt Millie had a saving for. So we had $4,000 in the bank.
Okay.
And so the cost for this place was $6,500. $6,500.
Okay.
So I write to Mr. Gooch in Maine and tell him we're interested. And he says, well, you should come and look at it. And then, this is 1961. Then I get this, I said, we better let this man know we're Negroes. Go driving up there. And then he says, no. I wrote to Mr. Gooch, Mr. Raymond Gooch. He responded. He said, I could care less what color you are. He said, you could be red, green, or whatever you want to be. He said, all I want to do is deal with an honest man.
Wow.
So Aunt Millie, we got in the car, packed up, and went up there. Now, in the meantime, I had to go to the bank to get my money. And this is Talladega, 1961. The old man sits there, the banker hit it. Boy, what you gonna do with all this money? I said, I'm gonna buy some land. You got a nice little nest egg here now. I don't want you going out there throwing this away. I said, I'm gonna buy some land. Where are you gonna buy land?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh no. So I said, Maine, that's Yankee land. Then he gives me this my money. So he sits there, and it must have been another 30 minutes before he would write my check. Wrote the check out, and we came up, and Aunt Millie drove us to Maine. And Mr. Gooch took us to Freeport, across the street from L.L. Bean.
Mm-hmm.
And negotiated this loan. I had no business transaction. And he said, I'll take back the loan. I didn't know what that meant. He said, you pay me $66 a month until you finish paying. So even after I left Talladega and I was teaching in Howard, I was sending $66. Finally, he sent me a batch of checks back. He said, you paid for it. Here's the deed. Don't send any more money.
Wow.
So that's how we got there. It was really a garage. They converted it with 2 little rooms and did have electricity and running water. When we arrived up there that day, and I said to Aunt Millie, tried to get her to decide whether or not, she said, no, you're supposed to be the visionary. She said, if you're buying it for what it is, you don't have very much. She said, but if you're buying it for what it can be, she said, you may have a gold mine. Who knows?
This woman. How inspiring.
She was really quite something. She had been a school teacher down in Savannah, Georgia. She came up here and married, and she and her husband never had children, but they adopted a brown baby in 1962, a little girl from Germany. And I stayed with her the final part of my graduate study at Catholic University. And I remember Aunt Millie being stern but encouraging, you know. And she would say to little Helga, who is a minister, got a doctorate and all of that now. Helga was, well, you can imagine, 5 years old, coming to this country, speaking no English, torn away from, she had been in an orphanage, torn away from her culture and this black family, because she didn't look very black. And like, how is she supposed to know what's going on? And she was very, I merely put her in a Catholic school and rigid and everything. And she would come home, and I remember she'd tell us we all going to hell because we're not Catholics.
No.
So the sisters say you're going to hell if you're not Catholic. And you know, and I merely said, just be patient with her. She said, I'm going to make something out of that child if it's the last thing I do. And she did it.
Wow.
Helga may be one of the speakers at church tomorrow.
Oh.
She's a minister. She got a degree in pharmacy. And, I mean, it was amazing, really. But anyway.
Okay, so looking back at the timeline, so you're at Talladega, you started in 55.
Yep.
You leave in 62. You buy the house in Maine in 61.
Right.
Okay. And can you talk a bit about how you got this position. You graduated, did someone recommend you? Was Hale Woodruff there? What was
the murals, the Amistad murals and all of that.
Yes.
I graduated in 1955. And of course, Professor Porter, I know, considered me one of his best students, because he said, you can't just be a painter, you have to do art history. He said, we have to have people to carry on the tradition. So I kind of felt like he was passing the mantle to me. I didn't think, I was vain enough to think nobody else had that kind of relationship with him.
Okay.
You know? And I guess to a certain extent that's true. I don't think he trusted the others with the art history part.
Okay.
And they were, you know, he had good students. And he was always encouraging. And so when I told him I wanted to teach, he said, well, we have to get a series of letters together and send them to the HBCUs. We didn't call them that then. And so he had his secretary sit down, Mrs. Scott, and write. He dictated what should be in the letter and had me give her a paragraph and so on. And we sent letters out to the black schools, mainly in the South. And they didn't check the envelope and what have you as well as, and I didn't either. And I wrote Talladega College, Talladega, Florida.
Oh, no.
So, in addition to Florida A&M, Tallahassee, Florida, and I'll send them all over. So the letter, I was told, was crossed out, no zip codes then. It said, try Alabama.
Wow.
Obviously they knew there was no Talladega in Florida. So they sent it up to Alabama. And Dr. Arthur D. Gray, president of Talladega College, got the letter and responded to me and said, regrettably, we have no opening, but we'll put your letter on file.
Okay.
Now, I have only a bachelor's degree. I'm 10 days out of bachelor's degree, but I'm confident. I'm ready.
You seem to be confident in every scenario.
Yes, I'm ready. I've had the best teachers. And so, a month later, I'm driving this taxi. I'm still maneuvering. And I get this letter from Dr. Arthur D. Gray, president, Talladega College. And he says, paraphrasing, but our art teacher, Mr. Claude Clark, has decided to go back to graduate school. He's leaving to go to California.
Mm-hmm.
We will have an opening in September. Would you be interested in applying?
Wow.
If so, fill out this application. I filled the application out. They didn't even ask, and they asked, and just names, you know, reference. Didn't even ask me to come. And a month later, I get a letter saying, we've decided to offer you a position as assistant professor in the, because it was the only art position there. And I was like in heaven, like, wow, I'm going to be an art professor.
Yeah.
And so, still living with Aunt Fanny, 554, 24th Street Northeast, Thelma and the two little girls by then. And so, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this thing? So, Thelma says, we'll stay here with Aunt Fanny until you go down and get set up. And so they stayed for most of the time there with Aunt Fanny. Of course, her mother was here too.
Mm-hmm.
And they came down in September. 3 weeks after school had gotten started. By that time, I had a house on campus.
Wow.
I had made our bed, a bookcase bed, and had twin beds for the little girls. And we had scoured around and gotten furniture. The Clarks had left their dining room set. I bought it for $35. 6 chairs, beautiful oak that Mr. Clark had stained himself.
Wow.
And a beautiful table. I have those at the guest house in Maine now. And we were ready, you know, and they came down, because I stayed in the dorm in the teacher's dorm until I got the house set up. And then they came down the end of September. And they had a little not nursery, but elementary school on campus, because they still had part of the residue but they didn't have high school any longer. So it was a private school on campus, so we enrolled the girls in the little private school on campus. And we stayed there 7 years.
Wow.
Until Howard came calling.
And you took a semester off while you were at Talladega to go to Catholic University.
Yes, because I've been going during the summer since 1958.
Okay.
3 years after arriving, doing graduate work. And then I was what they called the Danforth Associate on campus. In those days, the Danforth Foundation had these liaison people on all of the HBCU's campuses. And that's where I met so many of the prominent people, like Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was president of Morehouse College, and people like that, you know, because we'd go over to Morehouse to meet and so forth. So I was kind of in the mix early.
Well, what was the purpose of the Danforth organization?
Well, the Danforth people are out of St. Louis.
Okay.
Not necessarily a northern foundation, but they had so-called northern spirit in the sense of philanthropy. And they saw the need to do uplift and outreach and so forth and so on. But it wasn't all black college, it was integrated.
Okay.
And that was the first kind of integrated setting that I had in an educational situation. They were, when you would meet, and we'd meet at Atlanta University in the 50s, because the hotels weren't open in Atlanta at that time. We'd meet at Ware Hall, which was really the graduate school, at Atlanta U, because whites could stay there, blacks could stay there. And if we met in the north, no problem. But when we met in Atlanta, you had to meet on a black campus. But their aim was to bring about the best in education through this kind of coordinated services of a liaison from Emory, a liaison from Talladega, a liaison from AU, and so forth and so on, so that it was like what we envisioned the world to be, and knowing that it wasn't. And so I met people from all over like that. And then we'd go to Camp Minnewaca, in the summer in Michigan, which is way out beyond the peninsula. And we'd all be there together in the summer. We'd have 2 weeks. It was kind of semi-religious in a way. But you'd have the greatest of speakers. George Buttrick from Harvard, Paul Tillich from Harvard, and folk like that you'd read about. And inspiring topics beyond art, existentialism, and all kinds of things. And they would give you a $200 budget a year to buy books.
Wow.
And that's why I started having such a nice library. You could buy art books, you could buy any kind of books you wanted. And then they'd give you another $200 a year to entertain the students, to have them come in at least once or twice. And even when that was finished, when I came to Howard, I was not a Danforth associate. And I just kept doing that. I'd bring the students in. Mary was Mary Lovelace then, became Mary O'Neill. I mean, she still talks about that.
Yeah.
Sylvia Snowden, Stokely Carmichael, Jesse Norman,
Wow.
Harold Wheeler, the composer,
Wow.
all of those, they were in my classes. And Thelma would cook for them. They'd come and,
That's amazing.
and, I mean, Mary still talks about that, And I said, Mary, you're living in a dream world. People don't do that anymore. I can't get her to say David, Mr. Driskell. But remember Mr. Driskell, so-and-so. I said, yeah, that's...
Long ago. Well, let's talk about your exhibitions. You had your first art exhibition when you were at Talladega at the Savory Art Gallery.
1956.
And so what was in that show?
In that show, there were a number of still life paintings. It was a mixed bag.
Okay.
A few pines. And landscapes. Cityscapes. I don't know if there's a catalog in the Driskell archive for that show or not, but I know there's one for the Barnett Aiden Gallery in 57.
Yes. So you have Savory's your first solo exhibition, 56. I haven't seen a catalog for that.
Yeah, there may have been a catalog, but when I went to Europe in 1964 for the very first time, Thelma had somebody cleaning, and they threw out the files and everything.
What?
Oh yeah, they just didn't ask any questions.
Well,
So those things would have been there. And I had letters then, I'd write to anybody and say, I'm David Driskell. Can you lend me a Cézanne? Wrote to Edward G. Robinson, and I told him.
Really?
Yeah, I knew he was divorcing, they were having a divorce case. And he was giving work to it. I said, give some to Talladega, this black school, and you'll be doing a great favor. And he wrote back, and he said, I would love to, but because of the situation with my wife, I can't give. So I had letters there from Eleanor Roosevelt, and who wrote to me when Mr. Aiden died, and because I took over the gallery, because she came there in 1943 for the opening of the Barnett Aiden Gallery. I had my first letters of contract and all kinds of.
And they all disappeared?
I cried like a baby when I came back and learned that those.
All right, well, we won't talk about that.
Yeah.
But you do have a catalog from 1957.
Yeah.
Okay. And you had another show at Barnett Aiden in 62.
Which Porter wrote the little introduction.
Wow. What an honor. So, we talked about some of the awards that you got. We talked about, let's see, the John Hope Award in Art at Atlanta University.
Yeah, that was 1959.
And they acquired that work.
They acquired it.
Okay.
Young Pines Growing.
Yes. You got the Beaucourt Progress Award in Art from Skowhegan.
Skowhegan, 1953.
Now, what is that award? Is that...
They give different, in those days, I don't know if they still do, but the faculty would get together and say, this one should be given first place because this is the best painting done this summer. This one should be given the Beaucourt Progress Award because this person made more progress than anybody else. I made more progress according to, and it was a still life that they took of tiger lilies.
Okay.
The tiger lilies that grew outside of the studio.
So Skowhegan has a
still have it.
collection. Okay. All right.
Did you feel as though you had grown over that summer?
Oh yes, I had grown measurably. I could tell it because I was feeling confident in what I was doing. There that summer was Robert Clark, who became Robert Indiana.
Wow.
Alex Katz came in and
in 53 at Skowhegan.
yeah, he wasn't enrolled. He was living at Lakewood, which was where the Summer Thefts were I first saw professional theater. And Catherine Cornell was performing. And I mean, it was high cotton.
Yeah.
But I hadn't been exposed to that before, and I was like, oh, this is what it's about. yeah, you go and you live on a lake and you do this, and I've got to do this.
Yeah.
I give up Appalachia for this.
Yeah. Okay. And then, let's see, so you are at Talladega until 62. In 61, you finish your MFA at Catholic University. And then in 62, you decide to come back to Howard. So how did that decision happen?
Well, I was just getting settled in at Talladega, doing some of the things that I really wanted to do. I had studied ceramics for the first time because when they asked me to come to Talladega, I had to teach everything. Can you teach ceramics? I said, yes. I hadn't had a ceramics course. Can you teach some? Oh, of course, you know. I wasn't going to let that job go by. I had to feed my wife and 2 babies. So, and I learned. I learned to the extent that I could go out and dig clay, process it, make the glazes.
Right.
You know. And entered shows, won prizes with it. And so by the time I was ready, I kind of had in the back of my mind, Howard is the Mecca. Got to get back there. And when Professor Porter called me in September of 1962, I'd already signed my contract to go back to Talladega.
Yeah.
And he said, you must have known when you left that you'd be coming back. Well, I couldn't say yes, but I want to say, well, I hoped. You know, I thought I was the best. He hadn't invited anybody else back. So I get this call from him, and we just said, well, I signed a contract. That's a legal obligation. And I said, no, I'm going to Howard. And I stopped by on the way back to Talladega, and I signed in and everything, and then go on to Talladega, and then the president, the same President Arthur Gray, he says, you know, you're legally bound to come back here, and we could sue you. He says, but you have a bright future, and I don't want to stand in your way.
That is unheard of.
He said, so as much as we hate to see you go on to Howard. He said, there are great things ahead of you. And he said, but you've got to get somebody immediately to replace you. So I got Mr. Herring to go down.
Oh.
Mr. Herring.
He had retired.
Of course, but he was still active.
Okay.
Mr. Herring went down and spent the year, and that stayed, you know, part of the time with Thelma and the little girls, helping get them organized to move.
Okay.
And then we stayed in his house here at the Bonnet Aiden.
What a switch. That's amazing.
And the girls, you know, they kind of came up in that. We didn't have any art of our own at that time. But seeing all the art around, and there's a picture of when Daphne who came in with a little girl, her little granddaughter. She was 9 years old in October 1962. And Madame Lillian Madame Ivante was at the party that night. And she took Daphne over her knee and she said, you're 9, it's traditional, you get 9 spankings. And of course, Daphne never liked Madame Ivante after that.
Well, who would? What kind of rule is that?
Well, that was tradition in the black family in the South. You get a spanking for the number of years, and that would keep you humble.
Okay. I'm on Daphne's side on this one. So, let's see. So you're teaching at Howard University. You're there for 4 years.
Yeah.
And you're acting chair for 2 years.
For 2 years.
And that was
in Africa.
I see. Okay. And what did you have to do as chair? Was that like a promotion to you, or was that an extra burden?
Well, it was kind of like a promotion, but it was not easy. You know,
I
all
do.
these people had been my teachers, and the question of why would they choose them to? And the dean called me in and told me, he said, you know, you may think you're loved, but you're not as loved as you think you are. He said, but you're the person to do this job. And he said, regardless of what they say or what they want, you are to do this job.
Was Lois still there?
Yes.
And you were her chair?
Yes.
Wow.
Wow.
So, okay, so you did that for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 66, after 4 years at Howard, you go to Fisk.
I go to Fisk. I go down to Fisk to the Fine Arts Festival on the invitation of Aaron Douglas and Miss Mary Beatty Brady.
Did you know either of them at that point?
I knew Miss Brady.
Okay.
I had been in correspondence with Douglas, but I don't recall having ever met him prior to that. And I go down in the Fine Arts Festival, 1966, and it's glowing. Harry Belafonte is there.
Wow.
Sidney Poitier is there. John Killens is there as a writer and resident. And you know, at first I'm like, I'm gonna leave Howard and come to Fisk, you know, at first. But when I got there and saw what was going on, like, whoa, this place is rocking.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron Douglas was retiring.
Okay.
And he said to me, he said, now, you have a large faculty at Howard, and you know what it's like to be a chair. He said, we don't have a large faculty here. He said, but you can do what you want to here. He said, you've got an administration who wants you here so badly, they will do what you want. He said, ask them what you want. He said, I couldn't get it. He said, I was here too long.
I see.
He said, you could come in here and ask for what you want. Well, it's a small school, so I couldn't ask for so much. So I said, I have to have at least 2 additional full-time teachers and 1 part-time. I have to have a full-time secretary. And I couldn't name anything. They didn't say, yes, yes. I said, I have to have a building. And they said, well.
A new building?
Not a new building.
Okay.
But they had old buildings. I said, I have to have a building. They said, well, Dr. Lawson, James R. Lawson was president. He said, give us a little time to think about it. And he offered me I was associate professor at Howard, and he offered me a full professor. I said, no. I said, I will come here at the first year and be an associate professor. And if you're satisfied with what I do and the product that I bring you, you promote me the next year. He said, that's a deal. And then, of course, I was making $8,000 at Howard, which was big money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, maybe I was up to 10 by then because I was chairman, so I got a little extra for chairman. So they were offering me $12,000 to start. And he said, and next year, your salary will be $16,000. That was more than anybody, no scientist at Fisk was making that. And of course the word got around, and I was this young artist coming in there, they offering all this money, and it wasn't good for me, you know.
Mm-hmm.
A few people made kind of snide remarks and so, but for the most part the community was happy because I came and helped to change the culture.
So what was the culture like? I'm wondering why they were putting so much of an emphasis on art and bringing you in to develop or build a program.
Well, they had been left out of the art scene in Nashville for so long. They'd come over and listen to the Jubilee Singers, but they wouldn't come to exhibits or anything like that. So the notion was if they boosted the arts, the whole community would become more integrated, and Fisk would, because Fisk was the only place where there was real art in Nashville, the Stieglitz collection.
Right, that's right.
You couldn't go any other place in town and see a Blue Period Picasso, 10 Marston Hartless, you know,
But
2
no one
Georgia O'Keeffe's.
No one was coming. The community
No one was
wasn't
coming.
Interesting.
And it was, the gallery was dingy and dark, and they hadn't changed. You could see on the linoleum where Miss O'Keeffe had marked a red dot where she wanted her painting hung, where she wanted the Hartleys hung. They just glossed over it, you know. So I come young, 36 years old, vibrant with a new idea of what this is going to be. I have to have a gallery for exhibiting artists. I have to have a program to invite artists. I want a visiting artist program. They give me all of that. So why wouldn't I leave Howard? Howard didn't give it to me. And Aunt Millie gets in the picture again.
What? Now what happened? What did
Aunt
she
Millie
do?
says, go to Fisk.
Okay.
She said, you can stay at Howard and be a part of the ordinary. She said, they're not going to let you do those things. She said, you have vision. You want to do such and such a thing. She said, they're not going to let you do that at Howard. She said, do it and do it so well they'll ask you to come back as dean.
Wow.
And I go to Fisk. I bring in Jacob Lawrence, Romeo Bearden, Richard Hart, Walter Williams from Copenhagen. I'm the only one presenting these artists in catalog form. You know, not big, but by 1970, of course, Professor Porter dies.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no other school doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody speaks up for me at Rockefeller, they give me a grant to do something. And then they say, do you want to take off the summer and do such and such a thing? They give me another grant. And
So you're raising the profile
raising the profile.
all together at Fisk.
And get NEA grants and so forth and so on. And so then the Nashville newspapers start competing for reviewing the shows at Fisk, which they had never done before.
Wow.
So they started doing what George O'Keeffe told me that she wanted them to do. They started coming across the railroad track from Vanderbilt, from Peabody, from all those other schools. And the critics started saying, the only vibrant thing happening in the arts is happening at Fisk.
That's a big deal. So you had all of these artists coming in.
I had all these artists coming in, then I had artists coming in as artists in residence.
Okay. And were you showing their work in the galleries?
Not my work, but their work.
Yeah, you're showing their work in the galleries. Okay. And is it the Carl Van Vechten?
The Carl Van Vechten, but the Stiglitz collection was still there.
Yes.
But that house they gave me for the art department, this old 1888 house had been the school of the seminary for Fisk when it had a seminary.
Okay.
It was about 12 rooms. And I had them knock out walls so that the gallery was, you know, big as all these rooms together. Had the Toussaint Louverture series there. Had the John Henry series by Palmer Hayden. Had Richard Hunt sculpture there, John Roden sculpture. They had never seen anything like this before.
Tell us your process as a curator. You're writing letters to different people?
I'm writing letters, I know them. So I'm writing, if I don't know them, I write and say, look, here's what we've done. Don't you want to be a part of this? Who else is doing it? Nobody was doing it. So there was a psychology to the whole thing of getting them. Porter was our first visiting scholar.
Okay.
He came in January 1969 because he died the next year. But he was our very first visiting. No, 67.
Okay.
Yeah.
And he died in 70, you said.
Yeah, he died in February 1970. So we kind of had the ball rolling, and then the word got out, and the request comes to come to LA and do 2 centuries.
Well, yeah, in 1976. But before that, you're doing a number of different things. So I have here that you went to the Netherlands.
I went to 1964. I'm at Howard then. Okay.
So we'll backtrack just for a moment. And so you're getting a certificate in art history.
Yeah, the detour was my interest in Rembrandt, studying Rembrandt.
Okay.
And Dutch art, never with the intention of teaching it so much. But I had a wonderful connection to Fern Shapley who was over the Crest Foundation at the
Okay.
National Gallery of Art.
Wow.
And her husband, I was teaching one of the courses at Howard. He had retired from many places, Princeton, Harvard, you name it, but we would grab them if they were in Washington. And that's when we got the big grant forward with the notion that we would establish a PhD in art history.
At Howard. Okay.
And I left in the midst of all of that, and not because I left did it get distracted, but Professor Porter passed on, and then it kind of filtered by the wayside. But I had made all the requirements necessary for the Mid-Atlantic Accrediting Association to make it happen. You had to have at least 4 PhDs on the faculty
Okay.
at the time. So I had them ready to go. But, you know, a lot of other things intervened and it didn't happen.
Okay.
So,
Now, how did this study in the Netherlands? Well, we can talk about Rembrandt and why you were so interested in Rembrandt. When you learned about him when you were at Howard,
I learned about him at Howard.
and then was there something about him in particular that you were interested in, or influenced your
It
art?
influenced my drawings.
Okay.
You've probably never seen the drawings, but
I want to.
well, I became very interested with the notion that I would perhaps teach a seminar upon my return with the Dutch and Flemish specialist. That didn't happen until, and I didn't do any teaching with it. Arthur Wheelock at the National Gallery.
Yeah.
Later, I hired him when I became chairman at Maryland to teach Dutch and Flemish.
Wow.
And that's when, you know, the little Rembrandt there, when he saw it, you know, and he was like, this is as good as
It
any
gets.
impression I've seen, the final portrait, you know. But my aim was to be conversant in as many areas as possible,
Okay.
and not limited just to one area. And at that time, I was teaching a course, and I mentioned that the other day at the Howard colloquium,
Porter, yeah.
at the Porter colloquium, that I was teaching this course, kind of in disguise, called Modernist Aesthetics, Aesthetics and Modern Art.
Okay.
And that's the course that Stokely Carmichael was enrolled in. Mary was in the course, Harold Wheeler, Jesse Norman, and all those. Because the word had gotten around campus. They said, there's this young professor who's teaching about protest art and so forth. But you couldn't put that in the curriculum.
Right.
Even some professors came and sat in on the class. I remember Professor Tejera from Venezuela who taught philosophy. He came and sat in on the class. Professor Gardner, who was an English professor, he sat in on the class. And so, I mean, we were really a forum for ideas. And I remember, and I'd given papers to write and so forth. And Stokely and that crew, Ed Brown, who's now deceased, the brother of Rapp, but Rapp wasn't in at Howard.
Mm-hmm.
But Ed was one of the students. I just wrote something about him recently. They were all out helping to integrate out in Cambridge, Maryland, that really all-white area out there with all the black workers, farmers and what have you. And I remember giving a paper assignment, and Stokely wrote a paper. I know he has another name now, but to me it's Stokely. He wrote this paper, and I read it. I said, no. I said, you're a philosophy major. I can't accept this from you. I said, you can do better. He always called me Prof. He said, well, Prof, I'm in the movement. And I said, we're all in the movement. And so, in the end, only 2 people in that class got A's. And I mean, they worked for it. Stokely Carmichael
Really?
was one, and I want to say maybe Jesse Norman.
Really? So what year was this?
This was a 63,
Okay.
62, 63, 63, I think, around about that time.
Okay. Some other things I wanted to hear you talk about. I want to talk about the art that you were making, and also getting up to 1970, your trip to Nigeria, because that had what I think is true, a lasting effect on your artwork.
62, 63, 64. I was moving into abstraction,
Okay.
but I'm still going to the museums learning a good bit. So it's like the works in the show, and I'll get one of the, there was no catalog, but there was a brochure folder of
Which show?
at DC Moore now.
Oh, the one that's up now, yes.
So that's 65 through 2000
Okay.
select work. And I'm looking at stuff in the galleries and the museums, and I'm trying to resolve all these issues with my work. But I'm not trying to be a social commentary artist, but some of that won't leave. So one of the works that from that period, a little later, called Soul X. I don't think you've ever seen
I
that.
don't know this one.
It was in the Soul of a Nation when it came to Brooklyn, not in London, not at the Tate.
Okay.
And it's not traveling out to.
Yeah, because Soul's at the Broad right now,
Yeah.
but I don't know that.
But none
one.
of, see, my work wasn't originally included.
Okay.
And the curators at Brooklyn felt that it should be, and I said, okay, well, we included it in Brooklyn, but it won't travel.
Okay.
So there was a cross between, it was like crossing the line of abstraction, but it was still semi-figural.
Okay.
And
Another work that I have here of V.I. Wheat from 1968.
yeah, that to 68, and that was the last of these commentary things.
Okay, and your focus there was on the Vietnam War in
Vietnam
particular.
War. And
Okay.
if you read that little caption, it could be for the day as well.
Right.
It says, our war policy is not working, so and so and so.
But,
Kobe bought that.
oh, good. Okay. So you mentioned Aaron Douglas. He was reaching out to you to get you to come to Fisk, and he had been there and giving you advice on what you could do and how you should ask for it. Did you work with him, or did he leave when you got there? Or I was just trying to think of what kind of influence his work, but also since you had that proximity to him.
No, he stayed. He didn't leave,
Okay.
but he retired.
Okay.
But he let it be known that he was always available if I wanted, and I did. We consulted from time to time. But he was just so happy to see the growth of things. It wasn't a new building, but it was a building which had a painting studio, a graphic studio, ceramic studio, a design studio, kitchen and area for service, a big room for the kiln, and so he was just so proud of what
Yeah.
and he was so very cooperative.
Did you talk about making art or just the institutional?
He talked about making art, and some wonderful stories that, I've never told, and I probably won't, about how, the Harlem Renaissance, the people, his relationship with people like Charlotte Osgood Mason, who she wanted them to call her the godmother, and how she would pit one against the other, Langston against another writer, or try to pit him against Zora Neale Hurston, and just the kind of conflict that was going on. I got an education about the Harlem Renaissance that I couldn't have gotten any other way. And of course, Anna Bontemps was still there at that time.
Okay, wow.
He was still head librarian. And so I was kind of doused with this real thing that most people never got a chance to even be near. And then to bring in people
Right.
who either touched it or were coming along, you know, like Jake and Romy, and those were coming along at the time. They weren't a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but they were there as young learners. And of course, Palmer Hayden and folk like that. It was really almost like a little renaissance of sorts for that, almost that whole 10-year period. And artists kind of gravitated. We went all the way up to Afro-Cobra. I didn't have an Afro-Cobra show, but I had a show by at least 2 people who were Afro-Cobra people. And so it was like the place to be in the late 60s and the early 70s.
Were you going to New York? Were you going to galleries there while you were at Fisk? I was trying to think of, I mean, your house is full of Romare Bearden, and it's like, well, when did you meet? How did you meet? And did they see you as an artist and a professor, or what was your reputation with them? How did you meet Romare
Well, I had
Bearden?
met most of those artists as a student at the Barnett Aiden and at Howard.
I see.
But I hadn't really become that conversant with them or their style or what have you. And this audacity I had to say, I'm David Driskell, I'm at such and such place, I need your help. And they would respond.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So when I go to New York, I call Romy up and he said, well, let's go. Romy loved to eat. He said, let's go to a Chinese restaurant. He lived on Canal Street, you know. And after you walked up those flights of steps, you wanted to eat, you know. And we would, and if I didn't go downtown, they would meet me uptown or someplace, he and Nanette and so forth. And I was not in the mix with them in the sense of age, but they respected me for what I was doing, and they trusted me. So they would invite me to come to their studio, and then I started meeting the young artists like Bill Williams and Vince Smith and the others. And so it just all fitted together, you know. It was like I was there at that very important time where the gate was closing. And I was saying that to somebody last week in Howard. They didn't understand what I was saying. But I said, you live with Claude Clarkson, Romare Bearden, and Jacob Lawrence. I said, well, you could in those days if you had the right kind of relationship. And
did you trade works with them?
I traded works with them. I would almost never go to Bearden's studio without his giving me a work.
Really?
He was so kind and appreciative.
I've only heard wonderful things about him in that way.
Nanette didn't always want you to go out there because she knew he was so generous. But now Jake, it was almost strictly by the book as far as dealership. I never traded anything with him or got anything in that sense. But Romy was just, you know, he was too kind in some instances. People took advantage of him. I would trade with William T. and with Vince Smith and others. And then I'm trying to think of when I first met Catholic.
Oh.
And then the relationship broadened after I did a show of her work at Fisk in 1973.
A solo
I did.
show of her work?
Yeah.
Did you go to Cuernavaca?
Pardon?
Did you go to Mexico to her, or you saw her when she came back here?
At the beginning,
Okay.
here. But then I started going to Mexico when I worked for Cosby.
Wow.
And he would send me down and say, have her do such and such a thing, and have her do this. And then, you know, he would say, if she's going to cast it, make sure she cast an extra one for you. You know, that kind of.
Amazing. Okay. Well, let's talk about, since we're talking about traveling, going to Nigeria.
Let me come back to that.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, let's pause. Okay, we are back from a break. Bridget, why don't you pick us up where we left off?
Okay, so David, I wanted you to talk to us about how you got this opportunity to go to the University of Ife in Nigeria in 1969. And what was that experience like, teaching abroad?
In 1969, I was still at Fisk. I'd been there about 3 years. And the whole perspective on the Black Cultural Revolution was changing. It wasn't so local, it was becoming more international. And the sense of interest and commitment, you know, with after the first Fisk and all of that. And so if you didn't go, which I didn't go to Festac in Dakar. I'd been to Dakar and all that, but it wasn't like being there for that event.
Right.
Then what was the next link? What was the next big relationship that one wanted to establish? And so I was teaching a course in African art history, as well as African American. I guess Fisk and Howard were probably two of the few schools at that time teaching courses in those areas. And mine, because of the influence from Howard, from Porter, you know, trying to pick up the mantle and carry on as he had kind of commanded me to do. And so after the I would say overflow in the sense of the talk and all of the emphasis on what had happened at Festac, first one, there was a kind of renewal of interest in Africa in certain ways. The people who had gone and the people who hadn't, and for me it was almost back to the poetry. What is Africa to me? You know, how do I see it? I was finding that Fisk had this rich collection of African art that was hidden away in trunks in an old building. And luckily, I went and just something said, get this stuff out of there and start cataloging it and what have you. That stuff had been there since the 30s and had not been seen in old Livingston Hall in the spring of 1970. Now this, of course, is after I had gone to Ife. But I went over and got this stuff, and in their immature concept of what it was that they were protesting about, these kids burned that building in May of 1970. Now they said they didn't do it. They said somebody from the outside did it. But I think their rhetoric influenced it.
Okay.
And whereas they weren't, maybe they wouldn't have done it, but somebody said, oh, well then, if you can't teach black studies the way it ought to be taught, burn the so-and-so down. So they burned one of the oldest buildings on the campus.
At Fisk?
At Fisk, in May of 1970.
Okay.
And I had gone in there 1 month earlier and gotten all of these real treasures, many from 19th century Africa, and taken them to Ballantyne Hall, my building where, you know, and was cataloging them and everything. Now, some of the things we didn't get out, and some of the music, the old music from John Work and others that was still there, burned. So that was the kind of conflict that was going on at that time. And we had, you know, students, no longer students, but people from other parts of the country. I remember Eldridge Cleaver came, and I see his son on television on MSNBC occasionally. Cleveland Sellers.
Okay.
The fellow's name, his son, named almost like Obama's name, something.
Not sure. We'll put it in the
Baccara
transcript.
sellers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, they would come through, and I knew all of them from Howard and other places. So I get a chance to have correspondence with Professor Michael Crowder, an Englishman, who is heading up the program at IFE, and he comes over to visit. And he says, you know, you ought to come and spend some time with us at IFE and lecture on Black American art. And you know how the British look at all those things, quite different from what we do. So I thought, that sounds interesting. So I arranged with the administration to take off some time, and that I would go in December, so I wouldn't miss but so much time in the new semester, because I wanted to go other places. So I arranged to take off early December and start out in Dakar, Senegal, spend a little time in Gorée, and then down to my next stop would be Côte d'Ivoire. But on the way, as I was leaving, I stayed in Senegal for almost 2 weeks. And as I was leaving, at that time there was a line called Air Afrique, African airline. So I took I was taking Air Afrique, actually going from Dakar to Ghana, to Accra. And on the plane was Stokely Carmichael and Miriam Makeba. I got up to go to the bathroom, and I heard somebody call out, "Prof, what are you doing on it?" It was Stokely saying, he said, "I want you to meet my wife." You know, I had not met Miriam at that time. Now, go back to Stokely in the class. He was brilliant, you know, he was thinking way ahead of his time. But I remember he came in my office one day after I had gotten on him about this paper. And we were talking about the social situation. And Howard was jumping back in those days. I mean, the woman who was so controversial from Vietnam had come to speak, and it was just a hodgepodge of all kinds of things happening, you know. And Dr. King had been on campus and all of that. And I said to Stokely, I said, "Don't you think Dr. King ought to just concentrate on our situation here and not bring in the Vietnam War and all those other things?" And he hesitated, and then he said, "Prof," he said, "violence is violence. All over the world there's violence." And he said, "These are people of color." He said, "Even if they don't admit it, they are." And he said, "We're looking upon them with a superior attitude, that we can wipe them out with that napalm." And he gave me a lecture that I will never forget. He said, no, King cannot isolate our problem from their problem, and so forth.
And did he make you change your mind?
Did
he change your mind?
Yes, he did. And, you know, it, and I guess that's why the residue of the I Weep and all those kinds of things was still lingering, because I'm thinking about how he challenged me. And I haven't done any what I would call protest art since then. So on the plane was Stokely and his mother and Miriam. And he said, "Well, you're gonna have a 2-hour layover in Conakry." And he said, "Get off, I want you to meet my mother." And I did. You know, everything was loose on the planes. You didn't have to go with all that nonsense they have now. And so I got off and I met his mother and got back on and flew to Accra. No, flew to Abidjan.
Okay.
Côte d'Ivoire. And stayed there over the Christmas holiday at the Hotel Ipois, and went out a little bit, but not farther from there. And then after the holidays, I flew on to Accra and I looked up Vincent Kofi, who was a sculptor there, whom I had met, and through Miss Brady at the Harmon Foundation, because they had prepared me with all these African artists, you know.
Wow.
And a few other artists, and I went up to Kumasi, spent a few days up there, and then came back and flew on over to Nigeria. And when I arrived, of course, the Biafran War was going on, so the war was in progress, and it was very difficult to get out of Lagos because there were no commercial flights, no public transportation. And so I checked in at the Koi Hotel. And I won't go through all of that because some of that was miserable, and I don't tell that in polite company. You know, just the introduction to Nigeria, and I swore I'll never go back there in life again because, you know, it was rough. And so there was an Englishman who said to me, he said, "You're on your way to Ife, and I'm on my way to Ibadan." He said, "We're not going to get there by public transportation." He said, "We're going to have to hire a taxi." I said, "Hire a taxi to go?" He said, "Yes," and we did. And we were still, the soldiers were still, you know, occupying all the roads and everything. And they obviously, some of them couldn't read. They demand passport. You give them the passport, they have it upside down. They couldn't read it with the guns in their hands and so on. So a little frightening, but, you know, I've been through worse things than that. So we get to Ife, and things quiet, not Ife, but Ibadan, and things quiet down a bit. And I say I'm trying to get to Ife, no public transportation. So the Minister of Education was a woman who was having a luncheon, and she said, "Oh, a visiting professor from America, you must come with us." And very kind, generous, and I had lunch with him, and I gave my story. She said, "Well, there's no public transportation." She said, "But we're going to get you there. Try to get to Ife." And so I stayed overnight, and the next morning she sent someone over to bring me over to her office. And she said, "We worked out how we're going to get you to Ife. You're going in the mail truck."
Excellent.
So I get in the mail truck, and I don't know, it's another 6 hours? Close to that. And I arrive, and so when I arrive at Ife, the campus, have you been there?
No,
Beautiful
I've never been,
campus.
really.
Was designed by an Israeli architect. The buildings are like a ziggurat that's turned upside down. So that there is shade all the way up. And then the big part is at the top, you know. These
Wow.
beautiful campus. And it was fairly new at that time. So I arrived at Professor Crowder's residence, and everybody has 10 servants. One to do this, one to do that, one to do this, one.
This is at their house.
Yes, yes. So they said, "Well, you know, everybody's employed. They aren't getting any money hardly." But anyway, and I'm sitting in the truck waiting for instructions to get out or come in, and nobody comes out to greet me for a whole hour. And so finally, somebody comes out, and I said, "I'm waiting to find out where I'm going," and so says, "Oh, you're Professor Driskell?" I said, "Yes." And they were like, "Well, the professor doesn't ride in the mail truck, why?" You know, all these class distinctions. So finally, one of the servants for Professor Crowder comes out and invites me in. And by then I'm hungry and tired and sleepy and everything else. So eventually they say, "Oh, you're going to be staying at the chairman's lodge." So they take me over to a very nice house, you know, with well appointed and all. But it's like open housing in the sense that faculty from everywhere live in that particular building. And all I can remember is the dean of the School of Pharmacy, and he was from Egypt. Big man, who ate all of my food when I put it in the refrigerator, because if you put something in the refrigerator, it's communal. So I went out and bought all this food, got up the next morning, didn't have a single thing to eat.
Overnight, he ate all your food.
Yes, yeah. And so when I inquired, they said, oh, if you put it in the refrigerator, that means everybody's welcome. Well, where else was I supposed to put it? Well, anyway, long story short, it was a nice day, but I thought I was going to be lecturing to classes.
About art history.
About art history.
Okay.
I gave 2 lectures the whole time.
How?
It wasn't a whole semester, but it was like 2 months. And their notion is that a visiting professor just visits. He doesn't teach.
Were you being paid? Who was paying you?
I was being paid by the university a certain amount, plus I was being paid by Fisk. You know, I was getting my regular pay, but they were paying me a certain amount. It wasn't a bad salary.
But you were expecting to have to really
I
work.
was expected to work for it, no. But it was very educational in many ways. They took me to, it was mainly visiting other cities and towns. I went to Oshobo and to, to see all the ironworks of Ogun and what was the Europeans who had come there and established themselves so prominently.
In Nigeria?
Yeah, up at Oshobo in particular.
I don't know.
Oh, well, it'll come to me.
Say
But anyway,
Belgian people,
it's
but
a
I
man
don't
and a
know.
woman. I think of German extraction. Anyway, they were there. They built this big compound, and then, it was really amazing. Then we went to surrounding towns, cities, and went to an archaeological dig.
And you were by yourself, right? Thelma and the kids
Thelma
were
and
here.
the kids stayed in
Yeah.
Nashville.
And so, did you meet and talk with these African artists that
Oh,
Brady
yes.
had sent you? Okay.
I didn't get to talk with Ben Nwangu, who was, the most important Nigerian artist of the day. He had done that controversial statue of the Queen, made her look African and so on. But one of his colleagues, Solomon, okay.
Well, we can put it in later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, we went to Benin City.
Okay.
I met the Oba.
Did you have an assistant? Somebody that
Yes,
was your...
Femi Ojo
Okay.
was they don't call them, so they call them informants.
Okay.
Yeah, Femi Ojo. And he would be my interpreter when needed. But most of the time, everybody spoke English. Few people, kind of isolated, only spoke Yoruba. And they would laugh at me and say, he thinks he's English, he's Yoruba. And laugh because I couldn't speak Yoruba and so forth. And we'd go to, as I said, to various sites, archaeological digs. The most important visit for me was the visit with the Oba.
Okay.
And a very astute, erudite man whose grandfather had been deposed by the British in 1897. And
there's a picture of you two together in Julie's book.
In Julie's book, yes. In the palace there, and they didn't have as many other bronzes as one would expect, because the British had stolen all of them. And anyway, excuse me, British, but that's what you did. We went to Ikiti and places like that, not too far. One of the experiences there was very exciting. because the chief gave me a column, beautifully carved column, but I kept trying to tell him I can't bring it back, and I can't, this is history and it should remain here. But he was very disappointed that I didn't take it with me. But that was that kind of kindness and welcome and so forth.
Did you make art while you were there, or did you bring a portfolio to show them your work?
I did drawings, and I carried with me what I call a visual diary. Some of, some of them at the center, but I still have some of them. And as a matter of fact, what was the professor's name of it? Wisconsin, married an Ethiopian.
I don't know, David.
Anyway, she's an Africanist and taught African art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Okay.
I can see her face and all that,
Yeah.
but we won't worry about the name. Anyway, she's coming down to look at those books, because at each place I go, I do a book or tracing.
Now, I know that you have sketchbooks. I don't know how many you have, but when did you start the sketchbook tradition? Did you do this in the Netherlands?
I did, but I can't find that one.
Oh, sorry.
1964. I remember what was in it, the
Yeah.
drawings and all of that. Going to Denmark and going to the mounds and all that. And it's somewhere here.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know where. But the African sketchbooks, I have most of those. When I first went to South Africa in 1972, I have that one. And when I went back to Cote d'Ivoire in 1989, I think I have that one. And I usually, whenever I go on a trip for some extended period of time, I will do one. The China book is at the Library of Congress. They got that.
So amazing.
And the Yaddo book is at the Library of Congress also. But I did those journals, and Frida.
Oh, Tesca Borges?
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so when you came back, so I'm wondering, again, when you have these important moments in your life at different places, what the takeaways are. And I wonder, because there's so many masks in your work, that could come from the fact that you worked with so many professors at Howard that were thinking through the Harlem Renaissance and thinking about what is Africa
And Lois
to
Jones
me.
would bring masks into class for us to paint or draw.
Okay.
I have drawings and what have you.
Did your trip to Nigeria, and that was your first trip to Africa?
That was my first trip to Africa.
Did that have an impact on your work, on your art?
Definitely,
Okay.
yes. I started incorporating masks more prominently in my work. Statuary and even the collages, that kind of relationship was developed more thoroughly.
I was thinking about a work you made in 1970, Ghetto Wall 2, that's figurative and abstract with masks and mask-like faces, and wondering if there was that kind of connection, or if the connection is just visual, or is it about the culture? Is it a spiritual or religious connection?
Well, it's kind of a hodgepodge of many things. At the same time, trying not necessarily to pretend that I'm being African and making African art, but at the same time, obviously being influenced greatly by it, especially the iconography of it. And sometimes to me, and I try so hard not to let it just be design, but in some cases it becomes that, because I realize that I'm dealing with it out of context with the culture. So I have no institutional memory or anything like that, so I have to create it. So very often my notion, I live with masks and I interact with them on that level, but that's altogether different from seeing them in use in ceremony.
Right.
And being part and parcel of the culture.
So when you come back, you come back to Fisk,
Mm-hmm.
and what I have next written for you, I know that you've had continue to do many exhibitions. University of Tennessee in '71, the Virginia Davis Lasky Library in Nashville, Bowdoin College in 1973. That I wanted to hear you talk about the significance of Amistad 2 in 1975, Afro-American Art and exhibition that you curated. Could you talk to us about that? And I still haven't seen the catalog for that.
Oh.
I was looking at the
remind
transcripts.
me to give you one before
Okay.
you leave.
I was
Give it
looking
to
at
you tomorrow.
Okay. So looking at my transcripts from my last interview with you, and you said, I'll give you one before you leave.
Oh.
And then I forgot, so now I'm bringing
Okay.
it up again. It's I forgot and you forgot, so.
Yeah.
But I have been wanting to see the catalog, but
Yeah.
wanting to hear you now just talk about.
Well, it wasn't an extensive publication, but it was, I won't say groundbreaking, it was preliminary to 2 centuries, in that there was a format there that I had in mind that I thought would be good to expand it on. And when the chance came to do 2 centuries, it seemed like this was it. Now, Amistad 2 was basically what was at Fisk, of what we had at hand.
Okay.
And I wanted to get some of the younger voices in on that, but at the same time, I wanted to show the lineage of production from the older artists from 19th century into 20th century. And so you'll have, you know, all the way from Bannister and Duncanson into contemporary works, like, of course, not contemporary in the sense of Lawrence and Bearden and those, but some of the younger artists
Okay.
who came later. And that exhibition was sponsored by the United Church of Christ, our church, Congregational Church. I was at that time serving as a consultant for them. They had a very active art program called Religious Communities of the Arts, Architecture, Religious Communities of the Art, Architecture, and something, and the environment or something. It was really kind of ahead of time.
That
And we
doesn't
met in
sound like
different-
a church organization. That sounds like a different. It sounds like more of a social or philanthropic.
Combination of things. It
Okay.
was the first time, to my knowledge, that a denomination, a church of that stature, had committed itself to moving outside of the realm of, I mean, you talk about environment, talk about things that you don't normally deal with in
Right.
such a religious context. And we met in different places. I didn't go to the meeting in Montreal. I went to the meeting in Mexico City in 1978. And that was the first time I went to visit Betty Catlett. Because Cuernavaca's, you know, and she sent someone over to pick me up. And at that time, Judith Jameson and the Arthur Mitchell dance troupe was at the big national dance thing. It was amazing. It was just, and I went out to, you know, her place in Cuernavaca, and then I went to visit her many times thereafter. But that was the beginning. The next meeting I attended international, and it was really international in scope, was in 1973 in Jerusalem.
Wow.
And my roommate was the architect. Oh my goodness. He was Italian in origin, but he was an American architect who had this vision of converting architectural space. It was out in like New Mexico, Arizona, somewhere. He had like a colony out there, somewhat in the traditional Frank Lloyd Wright, but different. You made things Agostani or something like. Does that name ring a bell?
I think I know you're talking about. I can't call
Agostani or
it.
something. And I can't remember his name, but he and I were roommates. Like Polaria.
We'll look it up.
Look it up.
Okay.
In Jerusalem. We stayed at the St. George Hotel. It was quite an experience. Of course, visiting the Holy Land and all around and what have you. And interestingly enough, they'd say they didn't stamp our passports, because of the conflict. They said if you want to go to Egypt after that, you wouldn't get in. So they would put a piece of paper in our passports in Israel. But we went all over the entire country to see the mosaics in the floors of where the Romans were and all. It was really very, very educational. And then to see the new cities like Haifa and West Jerusalem and all of that. I think the organization was disbanded in the early 80s. But Amistad was a product of that relationship with the arts community.
So was there a purpose that was spiritual, that they funded your show because it somehow professed certain values or perspectives that the church wanted to make, or no?
Partly so.
Okay.
One of the directors was the director of the Amistad Research Center at Tulane. Well, it wasn't at Tulane then. It was just moving to New Orleans. And it was in the old Mint at that time. And Dr. Johnson, who was instrumental in helping to lend some of the things for the exhibition, like the chains, the slavery chains on the cover, and things like that, because the Amistad had a big collection. And later when I left Fisk, instead of leaving, it was up to me because they were on an indefinite loan during the tenure of David Driskell at Fisk from the Harmon Foundation. Miss Brady instructed me, gave me the responsibility of saying, these works should go to a place where they can be centrally used and not owned by one college, one HBCU. So even though the Amistad was located at Dillard University at that time, Dillard did not own them.
Okay.
The Amistad owned them. And eventually the Amistad ended up on the Tulane University campus because they gave them a building. But the collection does not belong to Tulane.
Okay.
The United Church of Christ still owns the collection.
So interesting. So the church bought a number of artworks.
They bought a number, they financed, I had a salary with the college, so I didn't have to give me but so much. But they financed my travel and consultant fees and so forth, and all putting it together.
Okay.
And it traveled all over the country, for a good while.
Okay. And then you were hired the year before in 1974 through 1976, is that correct? By LACMA, by the LA County Museum of Art. Can you talk about, please, the relationship, I guess we could start with how you were contacted, who contacted you to do the show, and then I would ask you the relationship between the two shows, that Amistad 2 was preliminary, but then how you explored your vision and expanded it.
Well, I kind of saw Amistad 2 as the forerunner for 2 centuries, and to kind of feel out where I could go to get certain things, what I could do. We had a lot of them already there at Fisk, so that wasn't the problem. But to make it larger, then we were going to have to look in different places. But the call to come to LA in the summer of 1974 to explore the possibility of doing this exhibition, and I think we've talked about it.
We've talked about it,
Yeah,
yes.
so much of that you already know. I was naive enough to assume that this was the beginning of the whole thing, and I didn't realize I was the last person they called on. And I guess it wasn't the easiest thing for some of my friends to know that I was going to do it when they had already been there.
So other people had interviewed and they were denied.
Yeah.
So other people wanted to do it, but they were not selected.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I didn't know, and nobody said a word about that.
Okay.
Charlie White kept saying, look, if you want it done and done right, get David Driskell. But nobody, like, who's Charlie? They didn't pay him any. He was on the Black Arts Council,
Right.
but they didn't pay him any attention. He's an artist. What does he know?
Mm.
And not that necessarily that was the only reason, but Charlie knew that I had been involved in this thing for a long time.
Sure.
It wasn't anything new for me. And he was being very cautious about who should be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the members of the Black Arts Council, they didn't know anything about me. They hadn't heard about me or anything. Well, Aurelia Brooks knew.
Sure,
'Cause we
yeah.
had classmates, at Howard and all of that. She would occasionally have amnesia and say, oh, I don't remember, just being funny. Saying she wasn't as old as I.
I see. She wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
So had they planned out exactly what the theme of the show would be, or was it because so many people were there who had no idea? They didn't believe that there was anything, that there were any black artists worth noting. And so the way, as I understand it, and as I've written about it in my book, Exhibiting Blackness,
Mm-hmm.
It was really up to you to prove that there was this aspect of art history and American history
Exactly.
to skeptical
Convince me.
and hostile people.
And hostile. Why would you want to do an exhibition of Black American art in 1976? And one person who will remain nameless said, I'm Jewish, but I wouldn't want to do an exhibition of Jewish art in 1976. And my response was, I know you know more about your culture than I do, but if you do, you would know there's no reason for you to do one, because Jewish people have always been at the forefront of American culture. They have led, I said, my most prominent teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I named some of them, including Morris Lewis and Jack Levine and so on. It was like, So I said, so why would you, I said, I'd be regurgitating something that you already know.
It's not
I
the
said,
same.
so now this exhibition is for you to learn beyond what you know. I had to let them know that I too sing America, and they needed to hear my song. And at that time, there were only only one black person on the Board of Trustees.
Robert Wilson.
Robert Wilson at Lockman.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an advocate from the beginning. He felt that, no, you need to listen, you need to learn. And, I simply said, I'm sure many of you have degrees in art history and whatever, but what do you know about African American artists? You read Helen Gardner, nobody's represented there.
Mm-hmm.
You read Robin Garrison, nobody's represented there. These are the standard texts. So you're not full American unless you know the full story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what John Obrecht said to me, who used to be director up at the gallery outside of Seattle.
Tacoma?
Mhm.
Is it Tacoma?
No,
Trying to think
the
of
other
name.
one, just almost like a suburb of Seattle, but it's a good sized gallery. But then he became director down at Willamette in Salem,
Is it
Oregon.
Bellingham,
Yes,
Washington? Okay.
Bellingham or Bellevue or something like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, Bellingham.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And so he had asked me to do a lecture when April Kingsley did African American Abstraction.
Yes.
And I said, I will lecture if you let me do a lecture which brings us to that period. I said, abstraction in the African American community didn't just pop up overnight. I said, there is a line that leads you to it. And I said, it starts in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
And I named these artists. He said, I never heard of them.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I have a PhD in American art history from University of Washington. He said, I've never heard of these people. He said, I felt cheated. The only artist he'd heard of was Tanner.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, there are more. So that's how Hidden Heritage came about.
Okay.
Yeah, he wanted to have some vivid proof that this had been going on.
And Hidden Heritage was, would you say that it was more focused or less artists than there were in the 2 Century show?
Yes, I would, because we tried to be inclusive of almost everything in 2 Century, you know, the crafts and
Yeah,
architecture.
baskets and dolls and
Yes,
architecture.
Indeed.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you a few questions about these shows, and I know we've already talked about them, but we want to put some things on the record, and people can look at the writing that's already been. But were there artists, black artists, that didn't want to be in either exhibition? The reason being, I was thinking, is because they didn't want to be in a show that was only black artists, but maybe there were other reasons. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, for some artists, it was probably a little painful because they kind of found themselves in no man's land. They knew they were American, and yet their friends didn't accept them, and they felt that they were doing as good or better than some of those, and which was true.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were kind of isolated out there. I don't like to call their names, but they were isolated out there saying, no, I don't want to just be called a black artist. And so I didn't include them, you know, based on their wishes. They have since reconsidered in many cases and said, yes, include me.
Right.
But it was kind of common knowledge as to why they felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was making the proposal to LACMA, and Leon Banks said, why aren't you including artists like Richard Hunt and Sam Gilliam and so forth and so on? And I had to explain, well, they're not being left out. If they weren't practicing artists prior to 1950, the definition is that we don't include them. Now, some of them in this book made art after that, but it's only because they were practicing artists prior. We cut it off at 1950. It's just too many to try and include.
Right.
So that got straightened out. They were still murmuring and whatever.
Sure. You can never make everybody happy.
No, never.
So I wanted to ask about two things. The documentation for both of these shows included a catalog, but also films. And these are really incredible documents. And I wanted you to say something about film. You were setting up a film program
At Fisk.
At Fisk.
In 1968, with a little grant from the American Film Institute. And at first they said they'd do it in the drama department, and the drama people said, no, we don't want it. We don't want any black stuff. You know, no, they didn't say it that way.
At Fisk?
But yeah, well, we had a hard time really making the curriculum balanced in that sense. We even had a big conference called towards a black university because we didn't feel that we were the blacker enough.
At Fisk?
At Fisk. And then they had a big one at Howard in 1968 toward a black university. That was a popular thing back then.
So was that about the tension between the faculty or the administration and the students?
Between faculty who felt there was too much emphasis on this thing about blackness, and that somehow or another we were going to lose some of our
Funders.
yes.
Okay. Well, now, but you established a film program
I established a
in
film program and invited Carlton Moss,
from Irvine,
From Irvine.
UC Irvine.
yes, to come, and he'd come once a month and stay like 4 days, and have this one course which became one of the most popular courses in the curriculum. The image of, a little sexist, it's an image of a black man in American films.
Mm-hmm.
But we start off with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner,
Oh, great.
and then come all the way up to where we were. And we had to limit the number of students who came from Vanderbilt because they really wanted to eat this course up,
Wow.
meaning they were mainly the white students. And then all of a sudden, black students had finished. This is our course, blah, 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 blah. And so it's whoever wants to learn, you know. So Carlton came, and we operated that program for the remainder of the time that I was at Fisk,
Okay.
and which was another 6 years or
Yeah.
more. And that's how, you know, Carlton, when I went out there, he introduced me to Sloan, Mel Sloan
Okay.
at USC.
Okay.
And I remember going out, we were having dinner at his house, and Mel said, I don't have any money left, and I was trying to get him to take Johnny Simmons as a young filmmaker. Johnny was
I
graduating
know that name.
1975. He's done a lot of commercial work, and he was nominated for what did they give for?
Was it a cinematographer?
Yeah, he's a
Okay.
cinematographer.
Yeah, I know that name.
And he teaches at he graduated from USC, but he teaches at UCLA.
Okay.
And
Okay.
he's worked with Sam Pollard and Carol Blue and all those. Anyway, Johnny was our primary student in that program. And I went out and literally did like I did at Howard, just sat in with him. Wouldn't leave his house until he promised me he was going to give him a scholarship.
Wow.
And so he gave him a scholarship, and Johnny went out, I think, in 1975. And he became the first African American to get an MFA in
Oh
cinematography
my
from
gosh.
USC.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, so who helped you with the films for these exhibitions? And what was your feeling about wanting to make films to accompany the exhibitions?
Well, I just felt that this was another medium that would help to explain what was going on and would help people to absorb the meaning of whatever the art was, because they would identify with film before they would go to an art exhibition.
Okay.
And so with 2 Centuries, we did a little with Pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
And David Adams, who owned Pyramid Films out in Santa Monica, he was a very devout religious man, and he wouldn't film anything on Sunday at his studio. So when we go out there, he'd turn the studio over to us. We'd film all day on Sunday. He had the best equipment for
Perfect.
everything. And he and Carlton were very good friends.
Okay.
And then Johnny, kind of came up in that same tradition. So I would get the money from corporate. At that time, nobody cared about whether you smoked or not. So I got plenty of money from Philip Morris and entities like that. And
Well, it's interesting because in these films, you are showing artists in their studios, but you're also you are also filmed. There you are,
Yeah.
walking into the museum, working with preparators. The way that the Hidden Heritage film starts is with you driving a car. I mean, it looks like a evening TV show from the 70s.
Yeah.
It's very hip.
Well, most of that was because Carlton was way ahead of time in his thinking process. And he's like, Dave, we ought to do so and so and so and so. And I say, if you game, I am.
Okay.
And he said, I think I could talk to so and so and so and get some money for that. And that's how we got a lot of that done. Excuse me, through the goodwill of people who really felt a need for that.
So, okay. In 1976, the show opens, and I wanted to also talk about, for 2 centuries, the catalog, which is so important for your essays. Absolutely, that it's become part of the curriculum for decades and decades, and thinking about Black aesthetics and the history of Black artists in all forms, visual forms. But the catalog was printed in such a high number. It was thousands more than most museums publish their catalogs, and so it really became a textbook moving forward from there, that you can still find them. And it's not, I mean, some people are selling them for hundreds of dollars, but you can find them for less because there still are so many.
Yeah, because they published more of this than they did of any other publication in Black Mile, I was told, except Scythian Gold.
Okay.
And the second highest number of people who saw an exhibition at Black Mile. I don't think they said that record has been broken other than this and Scythian Gold.
Okay. So, yeah, the irony, and we're still dealing with those kind of things today, even thinking about film in particular, how the market and the critics are skeptical. You know, you can't do this project or that project because people are not going to go see an exhibition that's all Black artists. People are not going to go see a film of an all Black cast or with Black protagonists. And then time and time again, I mean, now we're talking about the age of Black Panther as a film, right? And thinking about 2 centuries, and I think about how both of them have broken records when people are resigning from boards in the case of 2 centuries.
Yes,
saying,
like, you know, 2 of the curators said, if you bring this show, I will resign. I understand one of them stayed on.
And one resigned.
And one resigned.
Okay.
With limitations of, you know, but we haven't moved but so far away from that. You know, we're recreating that same pattern with so much of what we do in culture. We can't get over the notion that the most important thing in this whole equation is our likenesses and our humanity. The notion that there's this great divide, there is this difference, and what is the difference? Like, please. I get tired of trying to explain it.
Right. I know you must be exhausted of trying to explain it at this point.
But I can't give up on it because it's a part of my mission.
Yeah.
I took it on with the notion that I was going to be able to help. And I've got to prove that I can help.
Yeah, well, absolutely, no question that you've been a big part of change.
You know.
So, at the end of 1976, you leave Fisk, and you start at the University of Maryland College Park in 1977.
January 1977.
Okay.
I really didn't want to leave Fisk.
So why did you leave? How did that happen?
Because the atmosphere was changing.
Okay.
And there was a misunderstanding of what the role of the arts at Fisk were. They were those old timers who felt, all the sciences, we're going to be the greatest. And no, you're not going to be the greatest anymore, because there's so many other places where you can be greater, and you will never be there because you don't have the money, you don't have the facilities, and the bright black kids are going to Harvard and Yale and places like that.
Okay.
Anyway, so let down your buckets, in the words of Booker T. Washington, where you are, and do good when you can. And stop having this pie in the sky thing about we're the greatest. No, you're not. I wanted to stay and see this thing through, see the blossoming of the flowers from 2 centuries. When I arrived after 2 weeks and I had my classes covered with somebody teaching and so forth, the dean, and that was all a big thing in the LA Times and the New York Times and all, but 2 centuries. And the dean calls me in and he says, young man, we don't have room for superstars around here like you and C. Eric Lincoln. He named a whole host of people. I was like, I don't believe this.
Right.
I'm not trying to be a superstar. Every time my name was in the paper, Fisk's name was there.
That's right.
I tried to explain that to him. He didn't understand. He says, well, you were away and you couldn't be on this committee. And you could. I said, 2 weeks. I said, do you know the information that's out there about Fisk now because of this exhibition? Well, he didn't know and he didn't want to know. And in the meantime, I've already been approached by Dr. Corrigan at the University of Maryland to consider. I had lectured the summer of 1975 in the summer program at the University of Maryland, and they were like, oh, you ought to be here doing your research. I said, oh, no, I'm at Fisk. You know, I'm getting ready to do 2 centuries. I am not about to leave Fisk. And so I come back and the dean tells me.
I don't get it.
And so the word gets around and I speak with Sears Lincoln and Lou Outlaw and Professor Coles and a few others. I said, have you gotten this kind of treatment? They said, oh yeah, they tell us we can't miss a day, we can't miss committee. And so the dean was laughing about, well, they're not going anywhere. Who wants them? Where do they have to go? And so the next day I produced a letter saying I've been offered a chance to come to the University of Maryland and I think I will go. I said, however, I will not leave until December because I just gotten a $50,000 grant from NEA and I knew they would take that money and put it into operational costs. So I said, I want to be responsible and I want to make sure that that money is spent properly. So I'll stay until December.
Okay.
So then the board of trustees meeting, they didn't even know my name, the chairman. Young man, you're not going to leave this opportunity. I said, what opportunity? I said, do you know how I'm being treated?
I don't understand.
So then they all up in arms about my leaving and pretending that, but I was unwelcome. That's one of the reasons why I left. And I was promised that I'd be treated like a professor at Maryland, and I was. I was, even as chairman, I taught 3 courses. Ran the gallery.
Well, tell us what was the charge? You were going to go to University of Maryland, and was it to teach, was it to chair, was it to build?
To establish a curriculum in African American art history.
Okay.
It was not a single course on the book. There were 2 courses in African art history, but not in African American.
Now, where do you think that interest came from? Did it come from the students?
No, not so much from the students as from an informed provost.
Okay.
Dr. Corrigan, who at that time was engaged to an African American woman by the name of Joyce Mobley, who was in literature.
Okay.
And she had invited me to come in the summer of 1975 to lecture on the Harlem Renaissance.
Okay.
And the chairman of the Department of Art at that time was a 46 faculty person, Dr. George Levitine, came to the lecture and he validated my scholarship, which wasn't easy for that time, by saying, yes, indeed, there was a rebirth and so forth and so on. And we ought to be in on this. We ought to know this history. And so he wanted that information in the curriculum. And there was outreach for me to come. And I'm like, I'm not going to leave Fisk. I'm doing... And then when the dean says we don't have room for superstars like you, I'm not a superstar. I'm just teaching.
What a surprise to come back to all of that. And your show is touring. It goes to Brooklyn.
Oh, yes.
It goes...
Hadn't even gotten to New York then. Then I have my thing with Hilton Kramer. And
know.
I have to end up saying, you know, Hilton Kramer ought to shut up. Because all he's doing is making me famous in New York. But
and you're on TV with Tom Brokaw. I love that.
With Tom Brokaw. And, you know, and I say... Hilton Kramer, who's Hilton Kramer?
Right.
What does he know about black art? And
so the timing worked out. The dean has some problem with your success, and then Maryland, there's a few key people that decides that change needs to happen.
Maryland invites me to come and organize this group, teach 2 courses, and if I want to switch back and forth, I can still teach studio, but teach art history.
Wow.
Don't have a PhD. That's worrisome to the old faculty, because graduate students are going to work with me, and you're going to let them work with him. He doesn't have a PhD, and the chairman comes to my rescue. God rest his soul in peace. Dr. Levitine says, if that man were at Harvard with a bachelor's degree, you wouldn't question anything he said.
Wow.
He said, who amongst you have defined the field? And there was silence. And after that, nobody ever questioned my having PhD students.
That's a great story.
And the first one was Stratovia Benjamin and the young man who was killed that died after the accident, Guy McElroy, who wrote the first major book on Duncan.
That's right. And then Facing History came out. I think he was
Facing
deceased when
History.
that came out.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So tell us what were the classes that you taught, and what books did you use? Did you teach? Yeah, you go ahead.
Well, I started at the ground level of teaching African American art history in seminar form.
Okay.
And undergraduates and graduates could take the course. Required a little more of my graduate students than I did of the undergraduates. And in the first group that I can remember was Renee Aita and people like that, brilliant kids, you know. And they had this great desire to learn, and they weren't just happy to get it on the undergraduate level, they wanted graduate. So I kind of expanded it and so forth, and started offering seminars for the graduate students. So it got the master's level, then they wanted on the higher level for PhD students. So Beth Johns, who was an Americanist, kind of teamed with me. You know, she's teaching Aikens and folk like that. And so here's an extension of that. Aikens student, Tana. So it started making sense to some of them, not everybody. And the notion was, okay, let's take a chance and see what happens. And the students started coming. They started glowing, and oh, we've got so and so on it. And so.
So it was successful.
It was successful.
Okay, and you were there. Well, you were chair from 78 to 83.
Right.
And you took on all kinds of things, right? So that you're chairing, but you're mentoring students, you're defining a field.
Yeah.
You become distinguished professor in 1995.
Right.
And I will go back just a moment. Maybe this will be the last thing we talk about before we break until tomorrow. In 1977, the same year when you're starting at College Park, you become the consultant or advisor for the Cosby Collection.
Yes, in 1977.
And how did that come about?
Well, I in the bedroom one evening and I got this call. And from Bill Cosby, I didn't think it was he.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a brother-in-law, he's deceased now, but he and I would call each other up and pretend, change our voice, pretend we were so-and-so. This is so-and-so calling you about your taxes, and this is so-and-so. And so when he called, I said, yes, Scott, what do you want? And he said, Scott. Who's Scott? And I'm still thinking, because he sounded a little like my brother-in-law, Scott. I said, he said, I have your book here, and they tell me this is the Black Bible on art. And when he said, I have your book, I said, oh, no, that's not my brother-in-law. He doesn't even know I've written a book, And so I said, are you for real? He said, yeah, this is Bill Cosby. And I said, oh. I said, well, how can I help you? And then we go on, and he said, well, my wife and I are trying to expand our collection. He said, we have quite a number of Charles Whites. We have a lot of American art. He names Stuart Davis and other artists. So he said, but we want to buy more black artists. He said, they tell us you're the person that called on. So I then realized he was serious. I decided I would play hard to get, And I said, well, I really kind of committed now and have about as many consultant positions as I can take on.
Wow.
So he said, what do you mean? You mean you can't help us? I said, well, I don't mean that. I said, why don't you call me back in about 2 weeks and I can... He said, I don't wait for anybody for 2 weeks. He said, where's your wife? I said, what do you want? He said, let me speak to you.
Now he's going to charm her.
Yeah. He said, we want to invite you to come for Thanksgiving and have dinner with us. And
wow.
We live in Massachusetts and so forth and so on. And I said, well, we're family oriented. We don't go any place for Thanksgiving. He said, where is your wife? Can you please bring your wife to the phone? So I go get that one. And she's so excited. He says, I'm trying to get your husband to come and bring you. We'll have dinner, Thanksgiving dinner. And he says, no, you all don't go. She said, we can come. I said, okay. That does that, huh? And he then like, ha, 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 being all funny. He says, we're going to send for you, and blah, blah, blah. We're going to treat you nice, and blah, blah, blah. And they did, of course. But that was the beginning.
Did you was it just you and Thelma, or did you okay.
Just the two of us. So we took the train to Providence, Rhode Island. They sent a car over to Providence. We stayed overnight with some friends who were collectors there. And they picked us up and drove us on up another hour to a place in Massachusetts. And, that was the beginning. It was a little more than we were accustomed to, but we made amends and kind of started fitting in. But the one thing that was difficult at first was there was this company of people who were looking up and, to the hierarchy and so forth and so on. And you kind of felt like, well, do you want to be in that group?
Mm-hmm.
Everything that, you were going to sacrifice some values to be a part of that, because I hadn't been accustomed to that. And anyway, it turned out being a very interesting relationship, and we kind of decided. He said to me, you're the expert in art, and I'm the expert in entertainment. And he said, there are going to be times when we'll disagree. And he said, you'll probably know more about it than I. He said, but just remember, it's my money.
So you ended up thinking about a hierarchy, then meeting a whole new circle of people, I imagine, and yeah, but building one of the greatest collections of art by African American artists that exists.
Yeah, well, I really didn't have a limit as to where to go and what to seek out for long,
That's a dream.
Which was, I would never have been able to have that experience on my own.
Mm-hmm.
I'd go to Sotheby's and try and be inconspicuous. I'm the only black person there, so everybody sees me. They know why I'm there.
Right.
And when I purchased the Thankful Poor for them, I sent Stephen Jones.
Yes.
And did I tell you the story?
No, but I know Stephen Jones.
Yeah, and I
Philadelphia.
sent Harold Hart, who was at the Martha Jackson Gallery at the time, and I said to Stephen, I said, I've gotten wind that this thing is going to be way up there. I said, but I want you to bid up, if it goes, I want you to bid up to 50,000. And then I want Harold to bid up to, if it goes to 150, and then I'll take over after that. And so people were watching me, and I didn't have a paddle, and I wasn't bidding, and they just kept watching me like, what's going on? Who are these guys bidding? And I knew that there was a dealer from Rhode Island who was planning to get that painting at all costs.
Oh, no.
And, because he had called me and tried to get me in on a deal. If you put up 50,000, so-and-so put up 50,000, it's going to go to so-and-so. I said, I don't have that kind of money. I said, you're not supposed to be doing this anyway. So he said, well, you can do what you want with dealership and blah, blah, blah. So then I learned a lot as to how a lot of this happens, you see. But he was there bidding, and so was the Jordan brothers. After it got to like 100, 150, then I took over from Harold. But I didn't have a paddle, so they couldn't recognize me. So John Marin, who knew me and everything, I had Mr. Herring's scarf, a 1920 paisley, a silk paisley that nobody was paying attention to, and I just flipped it back. And they were trying to figure out, who is it? And he just said, the gentleman in the middle, so-and-so and so. And so eventually it goes up to 250,000.
Wow.
And the other person backs out. And because Camille was out in California, I'd called her the night before, because Bill wasn't supposed to know anything about it. This was a gift from her for Christmas.
Oh.
And I said, what is my ceiling? She said, I want the painting. Get the painting. So I felt like, oh, well, okay.
How fun.
I will do this one thing that I'll never get a chance to do again. And people think it's me. And so we got the painting. And the gentleman who was the lower bidder, he realized what was going on. And instead of taking it easy and lying down, he gets on the phone and calls Bill and tells him, Bill's not supposed to know.
Oh, no.
He said to me, he has to know, no woman can spend that kind of money. No woman, no wife has that kind of. So
he thought
now
that
they had been buying paintings from this dealer.
that
So
doesn't make
when I
sense.
told Camille, she said, that's it. I'll never buy another painting from him.
So did he think that you were buying it for yourself and not for the Cosby?
No, he knew I was buying it for them.
But why spoil it? He just
Well,
didn't
because he
believe
couldn't
you.
afford to buy it.
So just out of spite.
Yeah.
What is
So-
wrong with people?
Well, they haven't changed much.
All right. Now, what year was the Thankful Poor bought? What year did you buy it?
Thankful Poor was Bought in 1981.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, well, I think we're going to...
December 1981.
Okay. David, you and those dates, it's just too good. It is too good. So we're going to wrap up. And so we'll start again tomorrow. I'll figure out where. Thank you for your time and your day.
Sure.
Thank you.